Tonight, we're diving into 10,000 years of House Atreides, the long and noble history of the House of the Red Hawk, from its most ancient origins to the god who ruled beneath its banner for 35 centuries. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here that can reach you, only a slow and gentle telling of a family and its long, shining, and sorrowful road. Over the next 20 chapters we will trace, without haste, the whole of it, the ancient blood of old Earth, the ocean world of Caladan, the code of loyalty that defined them, the bitter feud with House Harkonnen, the fall of Duke Leto on the sands of Arrakis, the rise of Paul Muad'Dib, and the strange and lonely destiny of the God Emperor who would carry them across 10,000 years. You do not need to hold any of it. Let the story move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you, gently, down towards sleep. Chapter 1. The origins of House Atreides long ago, and far away, in an age so distant from our own that the very stars had shifted their patterns across the sky. There lived a family whose name would echo through more than 10,000 years of human history. They were called the Atreides, and to speak their names softly, here in the quiet of the evening, is to open a door into one of the oldest and most storied lineages ever, to walk among the countless worlds of the Imperium. Let your breath grow slow, and even as we begin, for this is a tale meant to carry you gently down into rest, and there is no need to hurry through any part of it. In the far future of humankind, long after the old cradle of Earth had faded into legend, the people of the stars had spread outward across the vast and silent gulfs between the suns. They had settled thousands upon thousands of worlds, from the green and gentle planets ringed with soft clouds to the harsh and lonely deserts where the wind moved endlessly over dunes of pale sand. And to hold all of these scattered worlds together, there had risen a great order of noble families, the great houses of the Landsraad, each one a small kingdom unto itself, each one governing its own planet or planets beneath the distant authority of the Padishah Emperor who sat upon the golden lion throne. Among these great houses, few were older or prouder than the House of Atreides. Theirs was a name that carried weight in the councils of the powerful, a name spoken with respect even by those who counted themselves rivals. For the Atreides were known across the Imperium for their honor, their loyalty, and the fierce devotion they inspired in those who served them. They were a house that ruled not through fear alone, but through something warmer and rarer, a bond of trust between the Lord and his people that no fortress wall could ever equal. And this quality, this gift for winning hearts and holding them, would prove to be both their greatest strength and, in the fullness of time, a part of their sorrow. To understand the Atreides, one must journey back in the imagination across an almost unthinkable stretch of years, back beyond the founding of the Imperium itself, back beyond the great migrations that carried humanity out among the stars. For the Atreides claimed a descent so ancient that it reached all the way to the lost and legendary world of old Earth, to the very morning of human memory. They traced their bloodline, so the old stories held, to the royal house of Atreides, that famous and fated line of kings whose deeds had been sung in the earliest tales ever told by human voices. The house of Atreides belonged to the age of Greek legend, an age of heroes and of gods, of walled cities gleaming upon their hilltops beneath a Mediterranean sun. From this house had come Agamemnon, the king of kings, the great commander who had gathered the fleets and armies of 100 lords and led them across the wine-dark sea to the towers of a distant city, there to wage a war that would be remembered for all the ages that followed. Agamemnon and his brother, and the fathers and sons of their proud and troubled line, had walked through stories of glory and of grief in equal measure, and their name had come down through the long corridors of time as a byword for greatness shadowed by tragedy. It was from this ancient royal line, so the Atreides believed, that their own blood had descended, passing quietly from generation to generation across the unmeasured centuries. Whether every link in that long chain could be proven, or whether some of it had passed into the softer country of myth and cherished memory, hardly mattered to those who carried the name. What mattered was the truth they felt in their bones, the sense that they were the inheritors of something very old and very noble, a torch passed from hand to hand down through 10,000 years and more, never once allowed to gutter out into darkness. And so the Atreides carried within them the marks of that ancient inheritance. There was the pride, first of all, a deep and steady pride that had nothing of arrogance in it, but rather the quiet confidence of a people who knew exactly who they were and where they had come from. There was nobility, not merely the nobility of titles and of thrones, but a nobility of spirit, a way of holding oneself with grace even in the hardest of hours. And there was, woven through it all like a dark thread through a bright cloth, that old and haunting streak of tragedy, the same shadow that had fallen upon the House of Atreides in the days of legend. For it seemed that the greatness of this line and its sorrow were bound together, two sides of a single coin, and that those who rose highest among the Atreides often had the furthest and the hardest way to fall. Yet let this not trouble you, here in the stillness of the night, for tragedy in the old sense was never merely sadness. It was the price that grandeur paid for being grand, the deep and solemn music that ran beneath the brightest triumphs. The Atreides understood this, in the way that very old families come to understand the rhythms of their own long history, and they carried the knowledge with a certain calm dignity, neither fleeing from it nor bowing beneath its weight. How, you might wonder, did so ancient a house come to hold its place among the ruling families of the Imperium in an age so far removed from the sunlit hills of old Earth? The answer lies in the long, slow patience of survival, in the quiet art of endurance that the Atreides seemed to possess above almost all others. Where other houses rose swiftly and fell just as swiftly, burning bright and then vanishing, the Atreides endured. They bent when they had to bend and stood firm when they had to stand, and always they kept faith with those who followed them, so that in every generation there were men and women willing to give everything for the sake of the green and black banner and the red hawk that adorned it. Through the great upheavals of human history, through the rise and fall of empires and the slow turning of the ages, the House of Atreides held on. They came at last to rule a world of their own, a place of oceans and of gentle rains, and there they built a seat of power that would stand for generations. From that world, they took their part in the affairs of the Landsraad, lending their voice to the councils of the great houses, honoring the ancient laws and customs by which the Imperium held itself together. And in all their dealings they remembered who they were, the sons and daughters of an old and royal line, keepers of a flame first kindled in the dawn of human memory. So it was that the name of Atreides came to shine among the stars, not as the loudest or the mightiest of names, but as one of the truest, a house of honor in an age that often had little use for honor, a house of loyalty in a universe where loyalty was a rare and precious thing, a house that carried its ancient pride and its ancient sorrow like a torch held high against the dark, passing it faithfully from father to son, from mother to child, across the long and patient centuries. And now, the family stood upon the edge of a new chapter in its endless story, though they could not yet see all that lay ahead. The old blood still ran warm in their veins. The old pride still burned steady in their hearts, and the ancient torch still glowed, waiting to be carried further into the unknown reaches of time. Rest easy now, and let the mind drift among these old and gentle thoughts, for there is much more to tell, and the night is long and kind. Up next in Chapter 2, The Blood of Old Earth and the House of Atreides, we will wander further back still into the sunlit and sorrowful legends of ancient Greece, to trace the deep roots of this proud family through the tale of Agamemnon and the fated line from which the Atreides believed themselves to spring. Chapter 2. The blood of old earth and the house of Atreides. To truly rest within the story of the Atreides, one must let the mind drift backward, gently and without hurry, across an expanse of time so vast that even the patient counting of stars would fail to measure it. For the great families of the Imperium did not appear out of nothing, and House Atreides least of all. Its name was not chosen lightly, nor invented in the manner of an ornament. That name was carried like a slow ember across the long dark centuries, guarded and remembered, a whisper handed from one generation to the next, until at last it burned quietly upon the worlds of the future. And the name reached backward, far beyond the founding of the Imperium, far beyond the first ships that crossed the fold of space, into a place that had become almost a dream. It reached back to old Earth, the ancient cradle world, and to a house of legend that had lived and suffered there in the deep past, the tragic and glorious house of Atreides. In the sleepy remembering of the Atreides, old Earth was less a planet than a mother half forgotten, a green and blue place from which all humankind had once come. The knowing of it had grown thin over the ages, thinned by migration and by war, and by the great scattering of peoples across the void. Yet it had never entirely vanished. Fragments survived, kept in the careful archives of noble houses and in the songs that mothers sang to drowsy children. And among those fragments, held with special tenderness by the ancestors of the Atreides, were the old tales of Greece, a land of sunlit hills and wine-dark seas, where heroes had walked and where the gods of story had once seemed very near. From that land, and from one particular royal line within it, the Atreides claimed their descent, and in that claim they found both their pride and their sorrow. The House of Atreides was a name spoken in the ancient legends with a mixture of awe and grief, for it was a house crowned with greatness and shadowed by doom in almost equal measure. Its founders and its heirs were kings and warriors, men and women of fierce spirit, and the stories told of them were stories of loyalty and betrayal, of honor guarded to the death, and of pride that reached too high. From this house came Agamemnon, the great king who led the gathered fleets of many lands across the water to the far walls of Troy, a leader of leaders, mighty and proud, whose name echoed through the centuries as a symbol of command. And beside him, in the old tales, stood his brother and his kin, a family bound together by blood and by a fate that seemed woven into their very lineage, a fate that would not release them. The legends told that a curse lay upon the house of Atreides, a long inheritance of tragedy passed from father to son and from son to grandson, so that greatness and grief walked always hand in hand within that line. There were tales of quarrels between brothers, of sacrifices made in sorrow, of loyalty tested past the point that the heart could bear. And yet, through all of it, threaded like gold through dark cloth, ran a thread of nobility that never quite broke. The men and women of Atreides were not small people. Even in their failings, they were vast. Even in their doom, they held to a certain terrible dignity, and it was this doubled inheritance, the nobility and the shadow together, that the Atreides of the far future understood themselves to have received. For when the leaders of that distant house looked upon the ancient story of Atreides, they did not turn away from its darkness. They did not pretend that they were descended only from the glory and not from the grief. Instead, they took the whole of it into themselves, quietly and gravely, and they made of it a kind of understanding about who they were and how they were meant to live. From Agamemnon and his line, they believed they had inherited a fierce love of family, a loyalty so deep that it could ask everything of a man and be given everything in return. They believed they had inherited a hunger for honor, a need to act rightly, and to be seen to act rightly, to hold to a code even when the holding of it was costly. And they believed, though they spoke of it more softly, that they had inherited also the old shadow, the nearness of tragedy, the sense that a great house lives always close to the edge of its own undoing. There was in this a strange and gentle comfort, the sort of comfort that comes from knowing a thing fully rather than only in part. The Atreides did not imagine themselves untouchable. They knew, in the marrow of their remembered history, that houses rise and houses fall, that the proudest names can be brought low, and that the very qualities which make a family great, its courage, its pride, its refusal to bend, can also become the door through which its sorrows enter. This knowledge did not make them fearful. Rather, it made them careful, and it made them kind in a way that only those who understand loss can truly be kind. They loved their people, and their people loved them, and much of that bond flowed from this ancient understanding of how precious and how fragile a good and honorable house could be. It is a wonder, when one considers it slowly in the quiet of the evening, that any memory at all could survive across such an ocean of years. Between the sunlit hills of old Greece and the star-spanning Imperium lay ages beyond counting, ages of forgetting, ages in which whole civilizations had risen and crumbled into dust. Languages had changed and changed again. Whole worlds had been settled and abandoned. And yet, the name endured. The story of Atreides, worn smooth by the passage of countless retellings, softened and simplified but never lost, traveled onward like a small bright coin, passed from hand to hand down the long corridor of time. That such a thing could happen speaks to how deeply human beings cherish their beginnings, how they cling to the tales of where they came from, and how a family in particular will hold to its name as to a treasure that no misfortune can quite take away. And so, the Atreides carried old earth within them, though not one among them had ever walked upon its soil. They carried the wine-dark sea in the sound of their name. They carried the pride of Agamemnon and the loyalty of his kin. And they carried, too, the memory of tears shed in legends so old that the very stars above old Earth had shifted in their courses since those tears were first imagined. All of this lived in the single word Atreides, a word that meant, to those who understood it, both a promise and a warning. The promise was of nobility, of a family that would strive to be worthy of the great names behind it. The warning was of the shadow that follows greatness, the doom that the old house had known, waiting always at the edge of the light. In this way, the far past and the far future were joined, gently, across the impossible distance between them. A house of legend on a half-forgotten world had lent its name and its spirit to a house of power among the stars, and the two had become. In a manner that only story can accomplish, a single unbroken line. The Atreides slept and woke and lived and ruled beneath the quiet weight of that inheritance, honored by it and burdened by it, shaped by the memory of heroes who had died before the first starship was ever dreamed. And it is fitting to let that thought settle now, softly, like a blanket drawn up in the dark. The thought of a name so old and so beloved that it crossed the whole of time to find its home among the worlds of the future. Up next in Chapter 3, The Rise of a Great House, we will follow the Atreides forward out of legend and into the living years of the Imperium, watching gently as they gather their lands and their loyal people and their quiet strength, and grow, ever so slowly, into one of the great houses whose name all the worlds would come to know. Chapter 3. The rise of a great house, the blood of old earth, carried across the long dark of the years, did not vanish when it settled among the countless stars of the human Imperium. It gathered instead, quietly and patiently, into a single line of women and men who would one day be known throughout the 10,000 worlds by the name of Atreides. And so, as you rest now beneath the soft weight of your blankets, let your thoughts drift slowly toward the tale of how that ancient blood rose, gentle season after gentle season, to become one of the great houses of the Landsraad. In the vast and ordered universe of the Imperium, power was never held in one hand alone, for the founders of that far age had learned, through sorrow and through wisdom, that no single ruler could safely command all the worlds. And so three great pillars came to stand together, each leaning upon the others in a slow and careful balance. There was the Padishah Emperor, seated upon the golden lion throne of House Corrino, whose word carried the weight of the imperial crown across all the settled stars. There was the mysterious guild, whose silent navigators alone could fold the immense distances between worlds and carry the ships of humankind from one sun to another. And there was the Landsraad, the great council of the noble houses, where the many families of the Imperium gathered to speak, to bargain, and to hold the throne itself within the gentle bounds of custom and law. It was into this council, this ancient and dignified assembly of the great and minor houses, that House Atreides slowly climbed. They did not rise by sudden conquest, nor by some single glittering stroke of fortune, but rather in the way that a tide rises upon a quiet shore, one soft swell after another, until at last the whole beach lies gleaming beneath the water. For generation upon generation, the Atreides earned their place through the steady practice of the virtues that their old blood remembered, and chief among these were honor and courage and the plain and unwavering habit of fair dealing. The name of Atreides was very old, older than many of the houses that sat beside them in the Landsraad, and it reached back through the long corridors of time to the legends of that first green world from which all people had come. From the house of Atreides of ancient Greece, the line took its name. A lineage of kings whose deeds had been sung when the human race was young, and its whole story could be held within the memory of a single planet. That the family had carried its name unbroken across such a gulf of centuries was itself a quiet wonder, and the Atreides bore it with a calm and settled pride, never boastful, never loud, but sure of who they were and of the long road that had brought them to the stars. In time, through the slow turning of imperial favor and the careful weaving of alliances, House Atreides was granted the stewardship of a world of their own, a fief held in trust beneath the great feudal order of the Imperium. And the world given into their keeping was Caladan, a gentle planet of wide and rolling oceans, of gray mists and green hills and the endless soft murmur of the sea. Under the rule of the Atreides dukes, Caladan became not merely a possession to be counted and taxed, but a true home. A place beloved by those who lived upon it, and cherished by the family who governed it. For 20 generations and more, the dukes of House Atreides held that ocean world, and each generation passed to the next the same quiet understanding that to rule well was first of all to serve. Now the order of the Imperium was a feudal one, arranged much like the kingdoms of that far and vanished earth, with each noble house holding its fief from the emperor and owing him loyalty in return. Within this order the houses were many, and their fortunes rose and fell like the slow breathing of some great and sleeping creature. Some houses grew rich upon trade and manufacture, and others upon the mining of rare metals, and others still upon the strength of their soldiers. And among all these many families, a few had grown so powerful and so renowned that they were counted among the great houses, the foremost of the Landsraad, whose voices carried furthest in the council, and whose names were known upon every world. House Atreides took its place among these great houses, and it stood in the wide web of imperial power alongside families whose names would one day be spoken together in the same breath as their own. There was House Corrino, the imperial house itself, holding the throne and the vast planet of Kytane, and the terrible loyalty of the emperor's own dreaded legions. And there was House Harkonnen, a family grown enormously wealthy and enormously strong. A house of a very different temper, whose methods leaned toward cunning and cruelty and the cold gathering of coin, and whose long and bitter feud with the Atreides reached back across many generations to old wounds that had never fully healed. Yet even beside such mighty and such dangerous neighbors, House Atreides held its ground, not through greater wealth nor through greater numbers, but through a strength of a subtler and a deeper kind. For the true strength of the Atreides lay not in their treasuries, nor even in their soldiers, though their soldiers were among the finest in all the Imperium, but rather in the loyalty they inspired and the love they were freely given. A ruler of that house did not command his people through fear alone, as the Harkonnens commanded theirs, but drew them to him through the plain and honest example of his own conduct. The Atreides dukes were known for keeping their word, for judging fairly between the great and the humble alike, for standing beside their soldiers in danger rather than sheltering behind them, and for holding always to a certain nobility of bearing that could be neither bought nor counterfeited. And because these things were true, and were seen to be true across the long years, the people of Caladan and the fighting men who served the Atreides banner gave their loyalty gladly and without reserve, so that the strength of the house was woven not of gold but of faithful hearts. This kind of strength, gentle though it seemed, was in truth the most formidable of all, and in the fullness of time it drew upon House Atreides an attention that was not entirely welcome. For across the many worlds of the Landsraad, the name of Atreides began to be spoken with respect and with admiration. And men looked to the ocean world and to its just and courageous dukes and saw in them a certain quality of leadership that the Imperium had grown unused to seeing. Word of this reputation traveled slowly outward, from world to world and from house to house, until at last it reached even the golden halls of the imperial throne itself. And there, upon the golden lion throne, the Padishah Emperor listened to the growing praise of House Atreides with a heart that grew slowly and quietly troubled. For an emperor whose own power rested upon the delicate balance of the great houses could not help but take notice of a family so beloved by its people and so honored among its peers, a family whose duke was spoken of as the kind of man that soldiers would follow anywhere and that other lords secretly wished to become. The emperor smiled upon House Atreides in the open councils of the Landsraad, and he named them his kinsmen, and he spoke of them with warmth. Yet beneath that warmth there stirred a colder feeling, an envy that gathered as softly and as patiently as the Atreides themselves had gathered their renown, so that the very qualities that made the house beloved by all began, in secret, to make it quietly feared by the one man whose favor it most needed to keep. And so the great house rose, honored and admired, beloved upon its ocean world, and respected across the whole wide reach of the Landsraad, yet watched now from the shadow of the throne, with a wary and an envious eye. Up next, in Chapter 4, Caladan, the ocean world, we'll drift down together through the gray and gentle mists to walk the shores of that beloved planet, to breathe the salt air of its endless seas, and to rest a while within the old stone halls where the dukes of House Atreides made their quiet and enduring home. Chapter 4. Caladan, the ocean world far from the burning sands that would one day come to shape the destiny of House Atreides, there lay a world of soft gray rain and endless water. A world where the sound of the sea was the first sound a child heard and the last sound a weary soul heard before sleep, and this world was called Caladan. It was the homeworld of the Atreides for 26 long generations, a gentle inheritance passed quietly from parent to child across the slow centuries. And to understand the people who would later walk the dunes of Arrakis, one must first come to know the tender and dripping green of the planet that made them. Caladan was a place of temperate seasons and mild airs, a world neither too hot nor too cold, a world where the clouds gathered low and patient over the horizon, and the rain fell in soft and unhurried curtains, and the whole of its surface seemed to breathe with the slow rhythm of tides. The seas of Caladan were wide beyond easy reckoning, spreading blue and gray and silver across the greater part of the planet, and upon those seas the light of the sun moved in long, shifting ribbons, dawn to dusk, tide to tide. When the winds came in from the deep water, they carried with them the clean smell of salt and kelp, and they moved through the coastal grasses with a sound like a long and quiet breath. The waves rolled in toward the shores in their patient thousands, rising and gathering and folding over into white foam, and then sliding back again across the wet stones. And this rising and falling never ceased, not in the deep of night nor in the pale of morning, so that every living thing upon Caladan grew up cradled within the ceaseless and soothing murmur of the ocean. It was said, gently and without boast, that a person born on Caladan carried the sound of the sea inside them always, a slow tide that beat somewhere beneath the heart, and that no distance and no passage of years could ever wholly still it. The lands of Caladan were green in a way that few worlds could match, for the rains that fell so freely nourished a soft and fertile country. There were rolling hills clothed in grasses that bent and shimmered beneath the wind, and there were valleys threaded with slow rivers that wound their unhurried way down to the sea. There were forests of dark and gentle trees whose leaves held the rain in bright and trembling drops, and there were wide meadows where wildflowers opened their pale faces to whatever softened sunlight the clouds allowed to pass. Mist lay often in the low places at the beginning of the day, a soft veil drifting between the trees, and it lifted slowly as the morning warmed, revealing the wet and glistening world beneath. Everywhere there was water, in the streams and the ponds and the rain barrels, in the dew upon the grass and the droplets clinging to the eaves. And this abundance of water was so ordinary and so constant that the people of Caladan scarcely thought to name it as a gift, though a gift it surely was. Among the low green fields there grew the pundi rice, the great crop of Caladan, cultivated in flooded paddies that lay across the coastal plains like broad and shining mirrors. The pundi rice farmers moved slowly through the shallow waters, tending the young shoots with quiet and practiced care, their reflections lying still beneath them upon the flooded ground. In the season of planting, the fields shimmered pale green with the new growth, and in the season of harvest they turned to soft and heavy gold, bending beneath the weight of the ripened grain, and the harvest was gathered in with old songs and older customs, passed down through the many generations who had worked that gentle land. And along the coasts there dwelt the fishing folk, the people of the boats and the nets and the quiet harbors, who rose before the dawn and put out upon the water while the sky was still the color of pearl. Their small craft moved out across the swells in patient lines, and the sound of their oars and their sails and their soft calls carried far across the water in the stillness of the early hour. They knew the moods of the sea as a friend knows the moods of a friend, and they read the clouds and the currents and the wheeling of the seabirds, and they returned again in the evening with their catch, guided home by the lights that glowed warm and steady along the shore. Above all this, upon a headland where the land met the sea, there stood Castle Caladan, the ancestral seat of House Atreides, an old and weathered pile of gray stone that had watched over the waters for 26 generations. It was a place of long halls and high windows, of worn steps and quiet courtyards, of thick walls that had stood against the salt winds of countless winters, and its stones had been darkened and softened by the endless rains until they seemed almost to have grown out of the very cliffs beneath them. From the high windows of the castle one could look out across the whole gray sweep of the sea, and watch the storms gather far away upon the horizon, and see the fishing boats come and go like small dark leaves upon the water. Within its walls the great house lived its quiet life, and the sound of the sea was never far from any room, seeping in through the old stone and the narrow glass, so that the lords of Caladan slept always to the rhythm of the tide, as their people did. From the highest to the lowest, it was this world of water and rain and patient green that shaped the very character of House Atreides, and shaped it deeply. The gentleness of Caladan, its softness and its abundance, seemed to settle into the temper of its people, giving them a steadiness and a warmth, an unhurried grace, a way of holding fast to what they loved without cruelty and without haste. There was in the Atreides a kind of calm depth, like the depth of the ocean itself, and there was too a loyalty as constant as the tides, and these were the quiet gifts of the world that had made them. How different it was, this cool and dripping paradise, from the parched and blazing desert that lay waiting for them in the years to come, a world of thirst, where a single cup of water was a treasure, and the rain never fell at all. The contrast could hardly have been greater, and perhaps it was the very greenness of Caladan, the very ease of its waters, that made the coming trial upon the sands so terribly hard, and yet also gave the Atreides the deep still strength they would need to endure it. Yet beyond all of this, beyond the fields and the harbors and the ancient castle upon its headland, the truest treasure of Caladan lay in the bond between the great house and the ordinary people of that beautiful and quiet planet. For the Atreides did not rule their world as strangers, but dwelt among it as its own, bound to the fishing folk and the rice farmers by long affection and old trust. And the people of Caladan loved their lords with a loyalty that no coin could purchase and no fear could compel. It was a love born of long years and small kindnesses, of shared storms and shared harvests, of a great house that had never forgotten the humble hands that fed it. And this bond, this deep and gentle bond between a people and their lords was the true and lasting wealth of the ocean world. And so Caladan turned quietly through its seasons, its rains falling soft upon the green, its tides rising and falling in their ancient patience, its people sleeping each night to the murmur of the sea that had cradled their fathers and their fathers before them, back and back through all the long and gentle years. Up next in Chapter 5, the Atreides Code of Loyalty and Honor, we'll drift gently into the quiet heart of what it truly meant to be Atreides. The deep and steady principles that bound the great house together, the honor that guided its every choice, and the loyalty that flowed like a tide between a noble family and all who served it. So rest now, and let the sound of the sea carry you softly onward. Chapter 5. The Atreides Code of Loyalty and Honor on the gentle world of Caladan. Beneath the soft gray skies and the murmur of the endless sea, House Atreides had grown into something that many of the other great families of the Imperium neither understood nor entirely trusted, and that quiet difference is the story we now settle into together, letting the calm of the night carry us deeper into the meaning of a house that ruled not by dread, but by devotion. For while so many of the noble houses of the Landsraad held their lands and their soldiers through fear, through the threat of punishment and the cold weight of coin, the Atreides had learned across many long and patient generations that there was another way to hold a people, a way that was slower to build and far more precious once it was made. And this way was the simple and enduring bond of loyalty freely given. To understand this house is to understand that they believed leadership was something that must be earned and never merely demanded, and that a lord who wished to be followed with a whole heart must first give his own heart in return. The men and women who served House Atreides were not driven forward by whips or by terror of what might befall them if they faltered, but were drawn forward instead by love, by admiration, and by the deep and steady knowledge that their lords saw them, valued them, and would stand beside them in the hardest hours. This was a rare and gentle kind of power, and though it was quieter than the cruelty of other houses, it ran far deeper into the bone. The Duke Leto Atreides, who is often called the Red Duke for the crimson of his banners, was the living heart of this tradition, and those who served him would have gladly followed him into any darkness, not because they were commanded to, but because they wished to. His warriors called themselves his men in a way that carried no shame and no bitterness, only pride, for to belong to the Atreides was understood among them as a mark of honor rather than a burden of servitude. A soldier of Caladan knew that his duke would not spend his life carelessly, that his family would be remembered and cared for should he fall, and that the house he served kept faith with those who kept faith with it. Such knowledge, gentle and certain, made his devotion something no coin could ever purchase, and no threat could ever break. This fierce and freely given loyalty was born from 100 small and steady acts, from the way the Duke walked among his fishermen and his spice merchants and his fighting men and knew their names and their sorrows, from the way he honored the memory of those who had died in his service, and from the way the house kept its word even when keeping it was costly. For the Atreides had earned across the long years a reputation that traveled far beyond their sea-washed world, a reputation for keeping their promises, for protecting their own, and for standing by the bargains they had made even when a lesser house would have found some clever reason to slip free. This truthfulness was not weakness in them, but a kind of quiet strength, a spine of honor that ran through everything they did. There is an old idea that the men closest to the Duke understood well. the idea of desert power, though few of them yet knew how deeply that idea would one day shape their fate. It was the understanding that the truest strength of a ruler lay not in the size of his treasury, nor in the reach of his weapons, but in the willing hearts of the people who followed him, in soldiers who fought as though each battle were their own, and not merely their master's. A people who loved their leader would give more than any hired army ever could, would endure more, would hope longer, and would hold together when everything around them was breaking. The Atreides had built exactly this, a devotion that was harder to buy and impossible to counterfeit, and in the fullness of time this would prove to be the deepest well of their strength. Yet the very qualities that made House Atreides so beloved and so strong also made them tender in places where crueler houses were armored, and this is one of the quiet sorrows woven through their story. For a house that keeps its word can be deceived by those who feel no such duty to keep theirs, and a house that protects its own can be wounded through the very people it loves. Their honor, which was their glory, was also a door that a patient and cunning enemy might one day learn to open. Because a man who will not stoop to treachery does not always expect it in others, and a heart that gives its trust openly can be betrayed by hands that have learned to smile while they plan a fall. The Atreides walked in the light, and those who walked in the shadows knew how to use that light against them. Still, the house never chose to abandon its honor in exchange for safety, and this was perhaps the truest measure of what set them apart from the harsher families of the Imperium. They might have ruled through fear and slept behind walls of terror, as others did, and they might have traded their gentleness for a colder and more guarded kind of security. Yet they did not, for they understood something that the cruel had forgotten. They understood that a house built on fear rots quietly from within, that servants who obey only from terror will flee or turn at the first sign of weakness, and that a throne held by dread is a lonely and brittle thing. The Atreides chose instead to be loved, and though love left them open to sorrow, it also gave them a strength that fear could never imitate. This moral center, this quiet insistence on decency in a universe that so often rewarded ruthlessness, was the thing that made House Atreides shine so brightly against the darkness of their age. In an imperium thick with poison and intrigue, where great families schemed against one another with cold and endless patience, the Atreides stood as a house that still believed in something larger than mere survival, that still held to loyalty and honor and the keeping of one's word as things worth any price. They were not perfect, for no house of men and women ever is, yet they carried within them a light that others had let go dim, and the people who lived beneath their banner knew that light and loved it, and would not willingly have traded it for all the security in the galaxy. And so, as the tide sighed against the shores of Caladan and the lamps of the old stone castle glowed warm against the coming night, House Atreides held its lands the way it had always held them, gently and truly, gathering to itself a loyalty that no gold could buy and no fear could compel. This was the treasure they carried into every hall and every quarrel of the great and dangerous Imperium, a treasure of devoted hearts, and it was a treasure that both lifted them high and marked them out for envy in the eyes of those who could not understand it. Rest now in the warmth of that gentle strength, in the thought of a house that chose love over fear and truth over cunning, and let the quiet of it settle softly over you, like a blanket drawn against the cold. Up next in Chapter 6, the long feud with House Harkonnen, we'll drift gently back across the long centuries of bitterness between the Atreides and their oldest enemies, and we'll wander softly through the ancient wound that bound these two great houses together in shadow, So let your breathing slow and your thoughts grow still as we prepare to follow that quiet and sorrowful thread. Chapter 6. The Long Feud. With House Harkonnen there are hatreds so old that no living person can remember the day they began. Hatreds that pass from parent to child, like the color of the eyes or the shape of the hands, and among all the ancient quarrels that ran like dark rivers through the long history of the Imperium, few were older, or deeper, or more patient than the enmity between House Atreides and House Harkonnen. To understand the sorrows that would one day gather over the family of Leto and Paul, you must first drift back across thousands of years, back beyond the age of the great Duke, back beyond the grandfathers of the grandfathers of the grandfathers, into a time so distant that it had softened into legend, and there you would find the first bitter seed from which all the later grief would slowly grow. The story reached back to a battle called Corrin, a name spoken with reverence in some halls and with shame in others, for it was one of the great turning points of human history. The moment when humankind broke, at last, the long dominion of the thinking machines. In that vast and terrible struggle, fought out among the cold stars near a distant sun, the fate of the whole species was said to have hung upon the courage of those who fought, and it was in that battle, so the old accounts insisted, that a Harkonnen of that far age committed the act that would stain his family forever. Some told it as cowardice, a failing of nerve at the very hour when nerve was most needed, and others told it as something darker still, a quiet treachery that placed thousands of lives in peril for the sake of one man's advantage. Whatever the truth of it, the deed was uncovered, and the Harkonnen was cast out in disgrace, stripped of honor and driven from the company of his fellows, and the shame of that banishment settled upon his whole line like a cold and lasting shadow. And here lies the root of the bitterness, for the Harkonnens never accepted that the fault was their own. They laid the blame instead upon an Atreides, upon an ancestor of that noble house, who was said to have brought the disgrace to light, who had stood as witness or as accuser, and who had let the shame fall where it fell. Whether the Atreides had acted from honor or from something less pure, the story did not always agree, but in the memory of the Harkonnens there formed a single unshakable conviction that it was the Atreides who had ruined them, the Atreides who had taken from them their standing and their pride, and that this wrong could never be forgiven and could never be forgotten, no matter how many centuries turned slowly past. So the feud was born, not in a single burst of violence, but in the slow hardening of resentment into hatred, and hatred into a kind of purpose that outlived every person who first felt it. Generation followed generation, and the two houses drifted apart across the great gulf of space, each taking its own path, each nursing its own understanding of the ancient quarrel. The Atreides carried themselves as men and women of honor, holding fast to loyalty and to the love of their people, building their strength upon trust freely given, so that those who served them gladly. And on the far side of that long enmity, the Harkonnens grew into something very different, a house that measured everything by gain and by power, that trusted no one, that saw kindness as weakness and mercy as a foolish waste, and that fed year upon year on the memory of an old wound it would not allow to heal. The seat of the Harkonnens was a world called Giedi Prime, a heavy and joyless planet where the sun hung dim and reddened in a hazy sky, a place of black stone and smoke and grinding industry, where the pleasures of the powerful were bought with the suffering of the powerless. There, in the later years of the long feud, ruled the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man of enormous body and enormous cunning, so vast in his flesh that he moved suspended upon devices that bore his weight. And yet beneath all that grossness there worked a mind of the sharpest and coldest kind. The Baron was patient in the way that only the deeply malicious can be patient, willing to wait for years, for decades, for a lifetime, so long as the waiting brought him at last to the moment he desired. He did not forget the old grievance. He tended it. He kept it alive within him like a low and steady flame, and he taught those around him to keep it alive as well. For the Baron, the hatred of the Atreides was not merely inherited feeling, but a living ambition, and he wanted more than the memory of old wrongs. He wanted to see the house of his enemies brought down entirely, its name erased, its line ended, its holdings taken, and he schemed toward that end with a slow and terrible thoroughness. Where the Atreides were open, the Harkonnens were hidden. Where the Atreides won love, the Harkonnens bought fear. And so the two families stood as opposites in almost every way, the one noble and beloved and generous, the other cruel and grasping and cold, and between them stretched the long, unbroken thread of an enmity older than any grudge that either living duke or living baron could truly claim to remember. Yet what made the feud so dangerous in those late years was not passion, but patience. The Baron did not rush. He understood that his enemies were strong, that the Atreides commanded fierce loyalty and skilled warriors and a reputation that shielded them across the Imperium, and that a blow struck too soon or too clumsily might rebound upon the striker. So he waited, and he watched, and he wove his plans in the deepest secrecy, drawing in threads of influence far beyond his own world, reaching toward powers greater even than himself, always with the same quiet aim held steady behind his half-closed eyes. He was content to let years pass, if the passing of years brought his enemies nearer to some carefully prepared trap. This was the shape of Harkonnen malice, not the hot fury of a moment, but the cold and calculated hunger of a hunter who has learned to sit motionless for as long as the prey requires. And so, while the Atreides went about their lives with honor, holding to the code that bound them and guarding the people who trusted them, there lay far off upon that dim and smoking world a patient enemy who thought of them always, who nursed an ancient grievance across the slow turning of the years, and who awaited only the right hour to move. The two houses were like two stars locked in a long, slow circling, drawn toward one another across an emptiness thousands of years wide. And though neither could yet see the exact shape of what was coming, the old momentum of the feud carried them both onward, gently, inevitably, toward a meeting that history had been preparing for a very, very long time. It is a sad thing, this weight of inherited hatred, and as you rest now in the quiet dark, you may let it drift past you like a distant cloud, knowing only that the Atreides carried their honor steadily forward, whatever waited beyond the edge of their sight. Up next in Chapter 7, Duke Leto the Just, we'll drift into the warm and steady heart of the great Duke himself, and learn how a single good man came to be loved by his people and feared by his enemies, and why his fairness shone all the brighter against the long shadow of the feud you have just heard told. Chapter 7, Duke Leto the Just. In the quiet years before the great troubles came, there lived upon the ocean world of Caladan a nobleman whose name would one day be spoken with reverence across 1,000 worlds, and his name was Leto, of the ancient House Atreides. He was the Duke of Caladan, the head of his house in what many would later call its most famous generation. And to understand the man is to understand the gentle strength of a leader who ruled not through fear, but through the deep and steady loyalty of those who followed him. Let your breathing slow now, and let the soft sound of distant waves carry you into the story of a good and honorable man. Caladan was a world of water and mist, of gray seas that rolled beneath gray skies, of fishing villages tucked into green hills, and of a great stone castle that had housed the Atreides for 26 generations. It was a gentle world, a world of rain that fell soft upon the fields, of pundi rice growing in the flooded terraces, and of harbors where the fishermen brought in their catch beneath the wheeling seabirds. The people of Caladan loved their duke, and their love was not the love that a frightened people give to a cruel master, but the true and freely given devotion that a people offer to a ruler who has cared for them well. Leto Atreides had inherited his title from his father, the old duke, a man remembered for his passion in the bullering and for his warmth, and Leto had grown into a leader of a quieter and steadier sort. He was a tall man, dark of hair, with gray eyes that held both kindness and a certain sorrow, for he carried the weight of his house upon his shoulders, and he understood that a great name brought both honor and danger. He governed Caladan with fairness, listening to the grievances of the smallest fishermen as readily as to the counsel of his ministers, and in all the years of his rule he sought to be, above every other thing, a just man. It was for this that his people called him Leto the Just, and it was a name he had earned in full measure. Around the Duke there gathered a council of men whose loyalty to him was famed throughout the Landsraad, that great assembly of the noble houses. There was Thufir Hawat, the aged mentat and master of assassins, whose mind had served 3 generations of Atreides, and whose careful thought guarded the house against its enemies. There was Gurney Halleck, the warrior troubadour, a scarred and rugged man who carried a 9-string baliset and who could sing as sweetly as he could fight, and who loved the Duke with a fierce and open heart. There was Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, swift and fearless and true, who had come to the Atreides as a boy and had grown into one of the finest blades in all the Imperium. And there was Dr. Wellington Yueh, the Suk physician, learned and gentle in his manner. These were the men of Leto's inner circle, and the bond between them and their duke was a rare and precious thing, forged not by coin nor by fear, but by mutual respect and by the deep trust of many years shared together. For Leto understood a truth that lesser lords forgot, which was that loyalty could not be bought and could not be commanded, but could only be earned through fairness and honored through faith. He gave his men his trust, and they returned it 100-fold, and this was the secret strength of House Atreides, greater than any army and more enduring than any fortress. Where other houses ruled through terror and through the informer and the poison cup, the Atreides ruled through devotion, and their soldiers would follow the Duke into any peril, for they knew that he would never spend their lives carelessly, nor treat them as anything less than the men they were. At the Duke's side, though not as his wife, was a woman of grace and mystery, the Lady Jessica, who had been trained in the ancient ways of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood. She had come to Caladan long before as his bound concubine, given to him by the sisterhood in the manner of their subtle plans, and yet what had begun as a matter of arrangement had grown into something far deeper, for Leto loved Jessica with all the quiet devotion of his heart, and she loved him in return. She was tall and lovely, with bronze-colored hair and green eyes, and she carried herself with the poise of her Bene Gesserit teaching, and she served the Duke as more than a companion, for she was his advisor, his confidante, and the mistress of his household. The Duke never married the Lady Jessica, and this was not for any lack of love, but rather for reasons of state that pained him greatly. So long as he remained unwed, the other noble houses of the Landsraad, could hope to bind themselves to House Atreides through a marriage alliance, and this hope kept many a powerful family friendly toward him. Had he wed Jessica, that hope would have vanished, and with it a measure of his political strength. And so Leto kept himself free, holding the possibility of marriage as a card yet unplayed, and both he and Jessica understood the sadness of it, and they bore it together with a dignity that only deepened the love between them. From this union came a son, a boy named Paul, the heir to the ducal house, and in this child Leto placed all his hopes for the future. Paul was a slender and grave boy, quick of mind and gentle of nature, and he was taught by the finest of his father's men. Thufir Hawat instructed him in the ways of the Mentat and in the arts of war and strategy. Gurney Halleck taught him the blade and the balisette both, and filled his lessons with old songs and older wisdom. Duncan Idaho showed him the swift dance of the sword, and his mother, the Lady Jessica, in quiet defiance of the sisterhood's rules, trained him in certain of the Bene Gesserit disciplines, so that the boy grew with gifts that few could imagine. Leto looked upon his son and saw in him the future of the house, and it filled the Duke with a tender and hopeful pride. As the years passed, the fame of Duke Leto grew ever brighter within the Landsraad. His fairness was known, his word was trusted, and his leadership commanded a respect that spread far beyond the misty shores of Caladan. Other noble houses looked to him as a man of honor in an age of treachery, and slowly, without his ever seeking it, Leto became a figure of great influence, a voice that many were glad to follow, a rallying point for those who wished for a nobler way of ruling. His military, though small, was disciplined and devoted, said by some to rival even the dreaded legions of the Emperor himself in skill, if not in number. And here lay the seed of the sorrow that would come, for far away upon the throne world of Kaitain there sat the Padishah Emperor, Shaddam IV, ruler of the known universe. And he watched the rising star of House Atreides with a growing and secret unease. An emperor rules by balance, by keeping the great houses divided and none too strong. And in Duke Leto he saw a man too popular to be left unchecked. A leader whose growing prestige might one day gather the Landsraad behind him and threaten the throne itself. The Emperor did not hate Leto for any wrong the Duke had done, for Leto had done no wrong, but rather he feared him for the very virtues that made him beloved, and this envy, quiet and cold, began to turn the great wheels of imperial scheming toward the noble house of Caladan. But that is a shadow for another night, and for now let Duke Leto stand in the warm light of his people's love, a just and gentle lord in the golden evening of his peace. Up next in Chapter 8, Lady Jessica of the Bene Gesserit will drift softly into the story of the woman who loved a duke and served an ancient sisterhood, and learn the gentle mysteries she carried in her quiet and watchful heart. Chapter 8. Lady Jessica of the Bene Gesserit. And so, as the sleep of the great Duke settles softly over the story, the gentle current of the tale turns now toward the woman who stood always at his side, the woman whose calm eyes seemed to hold a knowing that reached far beyond the walls of Castle Caladan, and her name was Jessica. She was the bound concubine of Duke Leto Atreides, the mother of his only son, and she was, above all these things, a daughter of the ancient and secret order known as the Bene Gesserit, the sisterhood whose quiet hands had shaped the destinies of the great houses for uncounted generations. In the hush of the sleeping castle, when the rain came down over the sea and the fires burned low in their hearths, it was Jessica who moved through the corridors with a stillness so complete that the very servants often did not hear her pass. And yet nothing in those halls escaped her gentle and patient attention. She had come to House Atreides many long years before, as a gift and as a mystery, sent by her order to serve the young Duke, and the sisterhood who had trained her from her earliest childhood had never meant for her heart to be given away. Yet the heart, even a heart shaped by the deep and hidden disciplines of the Bene Gesserit, is a thing that follows its own quiet law, and Jessica had come to love Leto with a love so genuine and so lasting that it became the truest thing in all her carefully ordered life. She loved the gravity of him, the sorrow that lived behind his kindness, the way he carried the weight of his people as though it were a thing he had chosen freely and would carry gladly to the end of his days. And in loving him, she had made a choice that the sisterhood had never sanctioned, a choice that would ripple outward through all the years that followed, for the Bene Gesserit did not send their daughters into the houses of the powerful for the sake of love, nor even for the sake of comfort or companionship, but for the sake of a design so vast and so patient that few living minds could hold the whole of it. Across the long centuries, the sisterhood had labored at a single quiet work, the careful joining of bloodline to bloodline, generation upon generation, guiding the marriages and the births of the great families toward a distant and secret purpose, known only to the innermost circles of their order. And in this great and gentle scheme, Jessica had been given one simple command, that she should bear to her Duke a daughter, a girl child, whose blood would carry the plan forward another step along its ancient road. Yet Jessica, in the deep privacy of her own loving heart, had chosen otherwise. Knowing well the powers her order had taught her, the subtle disciplines by which a Bene Gesserit could shape even the beginning of a life within her own body, she had used those very powers not to obey, but to give her beloved Leto the thing his soul most longed for, a son. She had borne him Paul, a boy child where her order had commanded a girl, and she had done this out of love, out of the tender wish to give the Duke an heir to carry his name and his honor into the years he himself might never see. It was a quiet defiance, a soft and secret rebellion against the mightiest of unseen powers, and she carried the knowledge of it gently within her, folded away like a letter never spoken aloud, a small warm act of love set against the cold and patient machinery of the sisterhood. To understand the depth of what she had risked, one must understand a little of what she was, for a Bene Gesserit was no ordinary woman of the Imperium. From the years of her earliest girlhood, Jessica had been trained in the ways of prana and bindu, the deep mastery of nerve and muscle and breath, so that she could command her own body with a precision that seemed to those who watched her almost beyond the reach of the merely human. She could still her own heart to a gentle drifting slowness. She could read the smallest tremor in a stranger's face and know from it the truth or the lie that lay behind their words, and she carried within her the gift of the truth-sayers, that quiet listening art by which falsehood could not easily pass unnoticed. She had learned, too, the art that the sisterhood called the voice, a way of speaking that reached beneath the ordinary hearing of the mind, a tone and a shaping of sound that could bend another will toward obedience, and though she used it rarely and softly, it lay always ready within her like a sword sheathed in velvet. Yet for all these hidden powers, the wonder of Jessica was not in her strength alone, but in the gentleness with which she wore it. She did not walk through the world as one who wished to be feared, but as one who wished, quietly and steadily, to protect the two souls she loved above all others. She watched over Paul with a mother's tenderness and a teacher's patient care, passing to him in secret lessons the beginnings of the very disciplines she herself had mastered. so that the boy grew strong in ways that few around him understood. And she watched over Leto with a love that asked for nothing, standing always a little apart, because the customs of the great houses would not let her be his wife, only his bound and beloved companion, and bearing that quiet sorrow with a grace that never once broke into complaint. There lived within her, all the while, a gentle tension that never fully eased, for she belonged at once to two worlds, and the loyalties of those worlds did not always run together like waters toward a single sea. She was a sister of the Bene Gesserit, bound by oaths older than any duke or emperor, trained to serve the vast and patient design of her order, and to keep its secrets close and safe. And she was a woman who loved a man and a child with the whole of her mortal heart, who would have set herself between them and any harm the universe might send. Between these two devotions, she walked a slow and careful path, keeping faith with the sisterhood in the small things, while quietly, tenderly, holding back for herself the deepest choices of her heart. And it was a balance so delicate that only a will as disciplined as hers could have carried it so long without breaking. And so we leave her here, in the soft light of Caladan, standing at a high window while the rain draws its silver threads down across the glass, her thoughts moving between the order that made her and the family that held her, a woman of hidden depths and quiet strength, of gentle love and secret defiance, watching over the sleeping house with eyes that saw further than most could dream. There is a stillness about her that belongs to deep water, a calm that holds within it currents no eye can trace. And in that calm, she waited, as she had learned so long ago to wait, patient and watchful and unafraid. Up next in Chapter 9, the men of House Atreides, Gurney, Duncan, and Thufir, will drift gently into the company of the three loyal men who stood as shield and sword and counsel around the Duke and his son, the warrior poet with his baliset and his old battle scars, the swordmaster whose laughter hid a fighter's deadly grace, and the aged mentat whose mind moved like a great slow tide through a lifetime of service, and we will rest a while in the warm and steady loyalty they carried, quiet as a candle burning against the dark. Chapter 9. The men of House Atreides, Gurney, Duncan, and Thufir around the Lady Jessica. In the quiet halls of the Atreides, there moved a small circle of men whose names were spoken with warmth in every corner of the household. And as the night settles gently around you now, it is worth resting a while in the company of these men. For they were the strong and faithful arms of the Duke, the ones upon whom House Atreides leaned in the years of its greatness, and each of them carried within him a devotion so deep and so quiet that it had become a part of the very stones of Castle Caladan. There was Gurney Halleck first, and of all the fighting men who served the red banner of the Atreides there was none quite like him, for he was a warrior and a singer, both, a man whose broad and homely face was marked by a long ink-vine scar that ran along his jaw, a scar he had carried since his years of suffering in the slave pits of the Harkonnens. And yet, for all the hardness that his history had written upon him, there lived inside Gurney a great and gentle music. He was a man of two hands, and each hand knew its own gift, for one hand could hold a blade and wield it with a fury that few upon any world could match, while the other hand could rest upon the strings of a 9-string baliset and draw from it songs so tender that grown soldiers would fall silent to listen. In the evenings, when the labors of the day were finished and the great hall grew warm and low with lamplight, Gurney would take up his instrument, that old baliset he loved so dearly, and he would play the marching airs of the Atreides and the softer ballads of longing and of home. and his rough voice would rise over the strings, and men who had seen terrible things would feel their hearts eased by the sound of him. He was called by some the valorous Gurney, and the name suited him, for he was brave beyond reckoning, and he loved the young heir Paul as though the boy were his own kin. It was Gurney who taught Paul the art of the blade in the training rooms of Caladan, drilling him again and again in the patient discipline of attack and defense. And though he was stern in these lessons and demanded much of his pupil, there was always beneath the sternness a great affection, for Gurney believed that a hard teacher gave the truest gift of all, which was the gift of survival. He carried always a certain saying near to his heart, a habit of quoting the old wisdoms and the ancient verses, and he wove these fragments of song and scripture into his speech so naturally that it seemed the poetry lived inside him as much as the fighting did. Fierce in battle and gentle in song, that was Gurney Halleck, and House Atreides was made stronger and warmer by the presence of him. Then there was Duncan Idaho, the swordmaster, and if you were to search across the whole of the known worlds for a finer blade than Duncan, you would search in vain, for he was among the greatest fighting men of his age, quick and sure and utterly fearless. He had come to the Atreides as a young man rescued from a hard beginning, and the house had raised him and trained him. And in return, he had given the whole of his heart to the family that had taken him in. Duncan was handsome in a rugged way, with a curling black hair and a merry temper, and he laughed easily and lived warmly, and the men who served beside him loved him for the plainness and the honesty of his spirit. He had studied among the sword masters of the Ginas, that famed school where only the very best of warriors were made, and he had earned his place there through long years of discipline, so that when he returned to the service of the Duke, he stood as one of the two finest fighters the house possessed, the other being Gurney himself. Between Duncan and young Paul there grew a bond of great sweetness, for Duncan too was a teacher of the air, and where Gurney taught with sternness, Duncan taught with a lighter and more playful hand, showing the boy the joy that could live even inside the discipline of the blade. Duncan was the kind of man who would give his life without a moment of hesitation for those he loved, and everyone who knew him understood this about him, that his loyalty was not a thing of duty alone, but a thing of the deepest love, a devotion so complete that it asked for nothing in return. He would stand at the front of any danger and shield the family behind him with his own body, and there was in him a shining and generous courage that made the people around him braver simply for being near to it. And there was Thufir Hawat, the oldest of the three and in his own way the most remarkable, for Thufir was a Mentat, one of those rare human beings whose minds had been trained across long decades to compute and to reason with a power that rivaled the thinking machines of the ancient past. In the far distant history of humankind, there had been a great turning away from such machines, and in their place mankind had cultivated the human mind itself to extraordinary heights, and the Mentats were the fruit of that cultivation. Men whose reason moved like a vast and patient engine. Thufir served House Atreides as its master of assassins, which is to say he was the keeper of the family's security and the weaver of its strategies, the one who studied the movements of enemies and calculated the shapes of things to come. His eyes and lips were stained a deep red from the sappho juice he drank to quicken the workings of his mind, and his face was old and lined and weathered, for he had served the Atreides through 3 generations, having given his loyalty first to Paul's grandfather, then to the Duke Leto, and now standing ready to serve the young heir in his turn. Thufir loved the family with the long and quiet love of a man who had watched them grow across the span of many years. And though his manner was grave, and his thoughts were forever turning over the dangers that pressed upon the house, there was in him a tenderness that showed itself in his care for the boy Paul, whom he had helped to teach in the ways of the Mentat, guiding the young mind through its first exercises in the pure and disciplined art of thinking. He was the aged and faithful counselor, the one whose experience ran deeper than any other in the household, and the Duke leaned upon his judgment in matters of the greatest weight, trusting the old man's computations as a captain trusts the stars by which he steers. Together these three men, the singer and warrior Gurney, the peerless swordmaster Duncan, and the ancient Mentat Thufir, formed a circle of strength and love around the Duke and his family, and the bonds between them were bonds of a kind that cannot be bought or commanded, but only earned across years of shared trials and shared bread. They had fought together and worried together and rejoiced together, and each of them held within his heart a picture of the family they served, a picture that gave their labors meaning and their courage its root. It was this deep loyalty, this affection woven through the whole of the household, that made House Atreides beloved among the great houses, for the people who served it did so not from fear, but from love, and love is the strongest foundation upon which any house may stand. And so the family rested easy in the keeping of these faithful men, secure in the knowledge that around them stood such guardians, and the warm lamplight of Caladan seemed to hold them all in a single gentle embrace. Up next in Chapter 10, The Emperor's Trap on Arrakis, we'll drift softly toward the distant desert world where a hidden snare was being laid, and we'll see how the fortunes of this beloved house were quietly being drawn toward the sands. Chapter 10. The Emperor's Trap on Arrakis. And so, having wandered gently among the men of House Atreides, having rested a while in the quiet strength of Duke Leto and the loyalty of those who served him, we turn now toward a far and distant throne, toward a decision made in a place of shining halls and cold ambition, a decision that would carry an entire noble family away from the green and gentle world they loved and into the endless dunes of a burning desert planet. Let your breathing grow slow and even as we go, for this is a story of a trap laid softly, of an honor that was truly a snare, and of good people walking toward danger with open eyes and quiet, unhurried courage. At the very center of the great and ancient empire that spread across 10,000 worlds there sat a single ruler, the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV, who governed from the golden world of Kaitain, a place so far removed from the troubles of common life that its skies were kept clear by machines and its gardens never knew a season of decay. From that high and glittering seat he watched over the many noble houses of the Landsraad, the great families who held their planets and their titles beneath his distant authority. And though he wore the appearance of calm and certainty, there lived within him a quiet and gnawing worry, a worry that had grown slowly across many years, the way a shadow lengthens as the afternoon wears on. The cause of his worry was not an army, and it was not a rebellion, and it was not any open act of defiance. The cause of his worry was a single man, a man of grace and honor and gentle bearing, a man whose name was spoken with warmth in 100 courts across the empire. That man was Duke Leto of House Atreides, lord of the ocean world of Caladan, and the trouble with the Duke, at least in the fearful mind of the Emperor, was simply that people loved him. They loved his fairness, and they loved his mercy. And they loved the way he kept his word, and among the other great houses of the Landsraad his name had begun to rise like a slow and steady tide, so that when the noble families gathered and spoke among themselves, it was to Leto that many of them turned. And it was in Leto that many of them placed a quiet and growing hope. To a ruler who trusted no one, such love was more dangerous than any fleet of warships, for a fleet could be counted and measured and met upon a field of battle, while the affection of a whole empire could not be seen or stopped, and it could gather in the hearts of powerful men until one day it might become a force greater than a throne. And so the emperor, sitting upon his golden seat, turned the matter over slowly in his mind, and he began to shape a plan. And the plan was cruel precisely because it was dressed in the clothing of kindness. Far across the empire, upon a harsh and industrial world called Giedi Prime, there ruled another house, a house that had been enemies of the Atreides for longer than any living person could clearly remember. This was House Harkonnen, led by the vast and calculating Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, a man whose greed was as wide as his patience was long. For 80 years the Harkonnens had held a single desert planet in Fief, a dry and forbidding world of sand and wind, and from that world they had grown enormously and unimaginably rich. Because that world, and that world alone in all the universe, produced the most precious substance ever known. The desert planet was called Arrakis, though many across the empire knew it simply by another and older name, the name that travelers spoke with a kind of hushed respect, the name Dune. And upon Arrakis, hidden within the vast oceans of sand, there formed the spice melange, the rarest treasure of all the worlds, a substance that lengthened human life, that sharpened the mind, and that made possible the great folded journeys of the Space Guild between the stars. Without the spice, the ships could not safely travel, and without travel, the empire itself would fall silent and still. And so whoever held Arrakis held their fingers upon the very pulse of civilization. Here, then, was the shape of the Emperor's quiet cruelty. He would take the desert planet away from House Harkonnen, and he would give it, with great ceremony and every appearance of high honor, to Duke Leto and House Atreides. To the watching empire, it would seem a magnificent reward, a sign of the Emperor's trust and favor, the granting of the richest prize in all the worlds to the most beloved of his dukes. Yet beneath that shining surface the truth was darker and colder, for the Emperor knew, as the Baron knew, that Arrakis was a place of terrible danger, a world where the Harkonnens had ruled for generations and knew every secret passage and every hidden weakness, a world stripped of easy defenses, a world where an unfamiliar house would stand exposed and vulnerable upon the open sand. And so, in the shadows behind the throne, a secret pact was made, a quiet and terrible agreement between the Emperor and the Baron. House Atreides would be lured to Arrakis by the promise of wealth and glory, and once they had come, once they had left behind the safety of their ocean home and settled upon the naked desert, the Harkonnens would fall upon them and destroy them utterly. And to make certain of the outcome, the Emperor would lend to the Baron his own most fearsome soldiers, the Sardaukar, the dreaded imperial legions raised upon a cruel prison world and trained into something very near to living weapons. Disguised in Harkonnen colors so that no proof might ever remain, these terrible warriors would ensure that House Atreides was swept away, and that the beloved Duke would trouble the Emperor's peace no more. What gives this story its quiet and aching weight is that Duke Leto was not a foolish man, and he did not walk toward the desert blind. He understood, in the careful chambers of his mind, that a gift so great could not be given without a hidden cost, and he sensed the shape of the snare even as he prepared to step within it. He knew that the offer of Arrakis was very likely a trap, and he spoke of it plainly with those he trusted most, weighing the danger with a soldier's honest eye. Yet he also understood that to refuse the emperor's command was itself a kind of ruin, and that the fortunes of his house and the safety of his people and the future of his son were now bound to this fateful desert world, whether he wished it or not. And so he chose to go, not in ignorance, but with his eyes fully open, carrying with him a fragile hope that upon Arrakis he might find some strength the emperor had not foreseen, some new source of power hidden within the sand and among the desert people. Then came the Great Migration, the slow uprooting of an entire noble house from the world that had cradled it for 26 generations. From the green shores and gray seas of Caladan, the Atreides gathered their household and their soldiers and their treasured things, and they carried them up into the waiting ships, leaving behind the rain and the fishing boats and the familiar castle by the water. Across the vast dark distance between the stars they traveled, folding space within the holds of the guild's enormous vessels, until at last they descended through a dry and dusty sky toward the desert city that would become their new and perilous home. And though banners flew and trumpets sounded and every ceremony of honor was observed, there hung over the arrival a feeling that many of them could sense, but none could quite name. The quiet feeling of a family stepping with dignity and grace into a shadow that had been prepared for them long before they ever came. So rest now, and let the dunes stretch out golden and endless in the calm of your imagining, and know that House Atreides has come at last to Arrakis, brave and beloved, and quietly aware of the danger that surrounds them. Up next in Chapter 11, The Fall of Duke Leto, we'll walk softly through the closing of the trap and the sorrowful courage of a good man in his final hours, all told gently as the desert wind settles and the long night deepens toward sleep. Chapter 11. The fall of House Atreides, the night that would end the reign of Duke Leto Atreides upon Arrakis, came softly at first, the way that the deepest sorrows so often do, arriving on a wind that seemed at the beginning like any other wind, warm and dry and threaded with the fine bright dust of the open desert. In the great stone house at Arrakis, the ancient residency that the Atreides had taken as their own only a short while before, the lamps burned low and the corridors lay quiet, and the men and women who served the Duke moved through their evening duties believing, as tired people believe, that the worst of the danger still lay ahead of them and not already upon them. The trap that the Padishah Emperor Shaddam IV had set with such patient care, working hand in secret hand with the old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, had by now closed nearly all the way around the house, and though few within those walls yet understood it, the long, slow tightening of that snare had reached its final and gentlest moment before the fall. For the Emperor had lent to the Baron a force that no ordinary noble house could ever hope to command, the Sardaukar, the soldier fanatics raised upon the harsh prison planet of Salusa Secundus. Warriors so terrible in their discipline that whole worlds had learned to yield at the mere rumor of their coming. And because the Emperor could not be seen to move openly against a great house of the Landsraad, these Sardaukar had been dressed in the working uniforms of Harkonnen troops, their insignia hidden, their true allegiance folded away beneath a borrowed cloth, so that the destruction of the Atreides might wear the face of a common feud between rival houses rather than the hand of the throne itself. In this quiet disguise, the finest fighters in the known universe gathered in the darkness beyond Arrakis, waiting for a single signal, waiting for a single door to be opened from within. That door was to be opened by a man who loved, and who had been broken through the thing he loved. Dr. Wellington Yue, the household physician, a man of the Suk school whose forehead bore the diamond tattoo that was meant across all the worlds to promise absolute and unbreakable trust, carried within him a grief that he had shown to no one. The Harkonnens had taken his wife, the Bene Gesserit woman Wana, and they had used her captivity as a slow and merciless lever against his heart, promising him again and again that his obedience might yet purchase her release, that his single act of treachery might restore to him the one person for whom he still drew breath. Yua did not believe, in the deepest and most honest chamber of his mind, that the Baron would ever truly free her, and yet a wounded love does not always listen to what the mind believes, and so the good doctor bent, and in his bending he prepared to do the thing that would haunt whatever remained of him. When the hour came, Dr. Yue moved through his part of the plan, with the numb and careful hands of a man walking in a dream he cannot wake from. He reached the great house shield generators, the humming machines whose invisible walls had until then held the residency safe against attack, and he stilled them, one after another, so that the protecting fields sank away into nothing and the house lay open to the night. Then he came at last to the Duke himself, and to Leto he gave a drug that loosened the limbs and clouded the will, so that the strong and watchful lord who had ruled with such fairness was made quiet and helpless as a sleeping child. Yet even in his betrayal the doctor could not surrender wholly to his masters, and so in secret he pressed upon the drugged Duke a final and terrible gift, a false tooth set within the mouth and filled with a killing gas, a hidden weapon meant for one last blow against the man who had ordered so much suffering. Beyond the walls the signal passed, and the disguised Sardaukar came down upon Arrakis with the swiftness of a falling stone. The lights of the city flickered, and the loyal soldiers of House Atreides woke to a battle already lost. For the shields were gone, and the enemy was already among them, and the numbers set against them were more than any courage could turn aside. Across the courtyards and the landing fields and the long stone halls the fighting spread, and then thinned. And the brave men who had followed the Red Hawk banner were scattered and struck down and carried away, and the great house that had held so much warmth and order was emptied of its people in the space of a single darkened night. From a calm and mournful distance one might picture it as a lamp guttering out in a wide black room, the light narrowing and narrowing until only memory remained where a whole household had lately stood. The drugged and captured Duke was carried at last before the old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, that vast and floating figure whose long hatred of the Atreides had finally been fed to its fill. Leto, though his body would no longer obey him and his mind swam in the fog of the doctor's drug, held within himself one small and desperate hope, the hidden tooth, the single chance to strike a final blow. Gathering what little remained of his strength, the fallen Duke bit down, and the killing gas burst forth in a pale cloud meant to carry the Baron into death alongside him. Yet fortune, which had turned so wholly against House Atreides, turned once more in that last instant, for the Baron's own swiftness and the quickness of those who guarded him drew the old man back beyond the reach of the vapor, and so Leto's final act took his own life, without taking the life he had sought. In this way the Duke passed from the world, not in the safety of his bed, nor at the far edge of a long old age, but bravely and bitterly in the ruin of his house, and those who told the story afterward would remember him less for the manner of his dying than for the honor with which he had lived. And yet, even in that hour of ending, the seed of all that was still to come had already slipped away into the darkness. For the Lady Jessica, the Duke's beloved Bene Gesserit concubine, and their son Paul, the boy of 15 years in whom so many hidden lines of fate had quietly gathered, were not among the taken and the fallen. Dr. Yue, in the last remnant of his conscience, had arranged for the two of them to be carried out beyond the city rather than slain, bound though they were, and through a chain of small mercies and smaller chances the mother and the son came free of their captors and turned their faces toward the one place that no army of the Baron would willingly follow. They went out into the deep desert, that vast and trackless ocean of moving sand where the great worms ruled and where the wild Fremen kept their secret ways, and behind them the lights of Arrakis grew small and then were lost, and before them lay only the wide and patient dark and the uncertain promise of survival. So closed the fall of House Atreides, gently now in the telling. A great and gracious family scattered upon the sand of a bitter world, its duke gone, its soldiers lost, its halls given over to its enemies. And still, beneath the sorrow of it, something living had endured, a mother and a boy walking outward beneath the two moons, carrying with them the last true hope of a broken house. Up next in Chapter 12, Paul and Jessica among the Fremen will follow the weary mother and son deeper into the desert night as they meet at last the free people of the sand, and will rest a while in the strange new shelter that begins, ever so slowly, to gather around the boy who would one day be called far more than the son of a fallen duke. Chapter 12. Paul and Jessica among the Fremen, when the great house of Atreides fell upon the sands of Arrakis, and the noble Duke Leto passed from the world of the living into the long silence beyond it. Two of his blood remained alive in the deep desert, carried far from the ruined city by fortune and by cunning. And this chapter tells the slow and tender story of how they came to belong to the people of the sand. The boy Paul, only 15 years of age, and his mother, the Lady Jessica, who carried within her the small and patient weight of an unborn child, found themselves cast out among the dunes with nothing but a stiltant, a few small tools of survival, and the desert stillsuits that gathered and preserved the precious water of their own bodies. All around them stretched an ocean of pale sand that shifted beneath the wind and the moons, an ocean without shore, and in the great hush of that wilderness, the two of them learned to move softly and to trust the ancient lessons that had been given to them. Through the long nights, they walked with a careful and broken rhythm, for Paul had studied the ways of the desert people and knew that the mighty sandworms, the great makers of Arrakis, were drawn to any steady drumming of feet upon the ground, and so mother and son learned to step without pattern, to shuffle and pause and drift, moving like the wind itself, so that the deep and slumbering giants would not rise to seek them. In those hours a change came quietly over Paul, for the strange spice of Arrakis, which saturated the very air of that world, had begun to open the doors of his awareness, and he saw within his mind the branching paths of what might come, faint and shimmering like light upon distant water, and he understood with a calm certainty that he and his mother were bound toward the desert folk who were called the Fremen. It was in the gray stillness before a dawn that the Fremen came to them, appearing as if the dunes themselves had gathered into the shapes of hooded men, silent and watchful, their eyes wholly blue from the spice, deep and gentle and fathomless as twilight. At their head stood a broad and steady man named Stilgar, a leader of the Sietch called Taber, a man of great patience and great fairness, whose voice, when at last he spoke, was low and measured. There was among the Fremen an old and cautious law that the water of the weak belonged to the tribe, and so for a breath the meeting stood upon a delicate edge, yet the Lady Jessica, who had been trained since childhood in the deep disciplines of the Bene Gesserit sisterhood, moved with a grace and a mastery that stilled every raised hand. And young Paul showed such quickness and such heart that Stilgar looked upon them both with wonder rather than with suspicion. And so, instead of casting them out to the sand, the Fremen chose to take them in, gathering the mother and her son into the folds of the tribe and leading them across the trackless waste toward the hidden refuge in the rock. The Sietch was a marvel to them, a secret world carved into the living stone of the mountains, sealed against the burning day and the thieving wind. And within its cool and shadowed chambers the Fremen kept the great treasure of their long labor, which was water. Vast reservoirs of water hoarded drop by drop across the generations, held in trust for a distant dream of a green and living Arrakis. Here the people lived close and warm, their children playing in the corridors, their weavers and their makers at their quiet work. And here, Paul and Jessica were given a place and were slowly woven into the life of the tribe. Paul was given the secret Sietch name of Usul, which meant the strength of the base of the pillar, a private and beloved name spoken among the near companions, and he chose for himself as well a public name of manhood, calling himself Muad'Dib, after the small desert mouse, whose wisdom and whose courage the Fremen admired. The little creature whose shape they saw, drawn in the face of the second moon. There came a solemn and momentous night when the tribe had need of a new reverend mother, for the old one who held the ancient memory was failing and near to death, and it fell to the Lady Jessica, by the depth of her training, to undertake the perilous rite that no other could survive. The Fremen brought to her the water of life, which was the deadly exhalation of a drowned sandworm, a substance so charged with poison that it slew all who could not transform it within their own bodies, and Jessica, gathering all her discipline about her like a cloak, took the fearful draught and turned it in the chemistry of her flesh from poison into blessing. In that dim inward crossing, she received the flooding memory of all the reverend mothers who had gone before, an endless river of lives pouring into her at once, and she became the mother of the tribe, the keeper of its sorrows and its wisdom. Yet something happened in that hour that had never happened in all the long history of the sisterhood, for the daughter sleeping unborn within her drank the same transformed water and awakened, and the tiny child who would be called Alia opened her awareness in the womb, receiving with her mother the whole weight of ancestral memory, so that she was born already knowing, a strange and wondrous child touched by the desert before she had ever seen the sky. The days that followed for Paul were days of learning, patient and unhurried, for the Fremen taught him their 1,000 small arts of living in the sand, how to read the signs of the weather and the movements of the worms, how to fight in their swift and flowing way, how to walk a whole night without waste of breath or water, and how to honor the discipline by which not a single drop of moisture was ever squandered. And the greatest of all these teachings came upon the day when Paul went out to call and to mount one of the great makers, the sandworm itself, the vast and ancient lord of the deep desert. With the maker hooks in his hands and the tribe watching from the crest of a dune, he planted his hooks and drew back a segment of the creature's ringed hide, and the enormous worm, unwilling to grind that tender flesh against the sand, rose and rolled its body so that the exposed ring stayed uppermost, and Paul climbed to its broad back and rode upon the desert as the Fremen had ridden for uncounted years, and in that ride he was truly made one of them. And in the Sietch there was a young woman named Chani, a daughter of the desert, with the fathomless blue eyes of her people, and a spirit both fierce and gentle. And between her and Paul there grew a love as quiet and as certain as water rising through stone. She became his teacher in the ways of the sand and his companion in the long nights. And the tenderness between them deepened until they were bound together, and in the warmth of that bond Paul found a home for his heart in the very place where his father had fallen. Around them, the strength of House Atreides began to gather again, not in banners or in halls of stone, but in the loyalty of the desert people, who saw in the boy something long awaited. And slowly, drop by drop, like the water in their sealed cisterns, a new power took shape in exile, patient and hidden, and growing beneath the wide and starry silence of the sand. Up next, in Chapter 13, Paul Muad'Dib and the Atreides Empire, we'll drift softly forward into the years when the boy of the desert grew into a leader of many, and the quiet strength gathered among the dunes began to rise like the dawn across all of Arrakis and far beyond it into the wide, sleeping stars. Chapter 13. Paul Muad'Dib and the Atreides Empire in the deep silence of the desert, where the great dunes lay one behind another like the slow breathing of a sleeping world. The young man who had come to the Fremen as a fugitive was becoming something far larger than a fugitive could ever be. He had entered their world with his mother beside him, hunted and homeless, the last son of a fallen house, and the sands had received him not as a stranger to be driven out, but as a shape long awaited in their oldest songs. Among the Sietch dwellers he took a new name, and the name was Muad'Dib, which was the name of the small desert mouse that lived by its own wisdom in the open waste, and it was also the name of a shape they saw in the second moon. To be called Muad'Dib was to be called clever in the ways of the desert, and to be Usul, which was the strength at the base of the pillar, was to be held close within the tribe. And so the boy who had been Paul Atreides came to wear these names softly, as a man wears a cloak against the cold of the long nights. The years among the Fremen passed like water sinking gently into sand, unseen from the surface, yet gathering somewhere deep. And in that gathering, Paul grew tall and lean and patient. He learned to ride the great makers, the sandworms of Arrakis, standing upon their vast ridged backs with the maker hooks in his hands, and this was a thing that marked a man as fully Fremen. He learned to walk without rhythm across the dunes so that the makers would not come, and he came to love the people who had taken him in, their fierceness and their loyalty and their quiet dreaming of a green world to come. Chani walked beside him through those years, the daughter of the planetologist Liet Kynes, a woman of the desert with eyes of the deepest blue within blue, and she became his beloved and the mother of his children. And in the private country of his heart, she was his true wife and his rest. Yet Paul carried within him a burden that the desert had sharpened rather than eased, for the spice of Arrakis, which soaked the food and the very air of that world, had opened in him the terrible gift of prescience that ran in the old bloodlines of his mother's order. He saw pathways stretching out before him across the years, branching and rejoining like the channels of a delta, and along many of those pathways he saw a great wave gathering, a wave of warriors carrying his name across the stars in fire and in slaughter. He did not wish for this wave. He looked for the narrow trail that might lead around it, and he found no trail that was wide enough or sure enough, and this knowing lay upon him quietly, even as the Fremen came to look to him as the voice foretold, the Lisan al-Gaib, the one who would lead them to their paradise. So the burden and the promise grew together in him, twined like two roots in the same dry ground. Now, upon Arrakis, the spice was the treasure of the whole Imperium, the substance that folded the minds of the guild navigators so that ships might cross the dark between the worlds, the substance without which the vast machinery of 10,000 planets would slow and falter and fall still. And Paul understood, with the cold, clear sight the desert had given him, that whoever could threaten the spice held in his hand the throat of the emperor and of every great house and of the guild itself. So, he did not lead the Fremen in scattered raids alone, though the raids came thick and constant against the Harkonnen masters who had returned to grind the planet for its wealth. He led them toward a single terrible certainty, the promise that if he were pressed too far, he would loose upon the sand the power to destroy the spice utterly and forever, and that threat lay beneath all his patience, like bedrock beneath the dunes. The war upon the spice tightened slowly, and then all at once. The Fremen legions, hardened in the deep desert and armed now in their thousands, struck at the spice harvesters and the storehouses and the garrisons, until the flow of the precious dust faltered across the Imperium, and the price of it climbed beyond all reckoning, and the great powers grew fearful. At last the Padishah Emperor himself, Shaddam IV of House Corino, came to Arrakis in his own person, bringing his court and his household and the dreaded Sardaukar, the soldier fanatics whose ferocity had held the throne of 1,000,000 worlds for uncounted generations. He landed his vast conjoined ships upon the plain before the shield wall that sheltered the city of Arrakis, and with him came the Harkonnens who had murdered Paul's father, the fat old Baron Vladimir and his nephews, and there upon the open ground the last reckoning was prepared. Then came the day that the Fremen would sing of for 1,000 years. Paul Muad'Dib had gathered his warriors within the desert and had taken the strange dust of a drowned maker to open his sight to its fullest reach. And he saw the moment and moved into it without flinching. He unleashed the atomics his family had hidden away, not against men, but against the great shield wall of rock, and the barrier that had always turned aside the desert storms was torn open. Through that gap, the mother of all storms came howling with its blinding sand, and behind the storm, riding upon 100 and more of the great makers whose backs rose like moving hills, the Fremen swept down upon the Emperor's host. The Sardaukar, who had never known defeat, met the sandworms and the desert warriors, and were broken and scattered and swallowed, and the whole proud array of the Imperium came apart upon the plain like a rope of sand. Into the great hall of the captured residency Paul came at last as a conqueror, and there he stood before the fallen emperor and the ruined Harkonnens and the watching guild and the reverend mother of his mother's order, and he was no longer a hunted boy, but the master of Arrakis, and the master of the spice. The old Baron Vladimir Harkonnen met his end there, and there remained the Emperor's champion, the young Harkonnen Feyd-Rautha, who claimed the right to face Paul in single combat with the blade. So the two of them fought upon the floor of that hall, knife against knife, and though the fight was close, and bitter Paul at the last set his blade home, and the Harkonnen line fell silent with its final air, and Shaddam IV, stripped of his soldiers and his terror, surrendered the Golden Lion throne, and the long reign of House Corino came to its ending. So House Atreides, which had been driven down into death and exile, rose in a single storm to the very summit of the known universe, and Paul Muad'Dib took the imperial throne that 10,000 worlds obeyed. To bind the great houses to peace, he took the emperor's eldest daughter, the Princess Irulan, to be his wife in name and title, that her children might one day be called of the blood of both lines. Yet his heart remained wholly with Chani of the desert, and it was she who held his love and his true companionship, while Irulan held only the empty honor of the name. Thus the boy of Caladan became Paul I, emperor of a universe, and the green banner of the Atreides hung above the throne of the Corrinos. And yet the wave that Paul had seen and dreaded could not be turned aside even by an emperor. In his name, though not always by his command, the Fremen legions poured out from Arrakis across the stars, carrying their faith and their fury to world after world, and the great jihad went forth and burned through the Imperium in a tide of holy war. Paul beheld it with sorrow even in his triumph, knowing the cost written in all his branching visions, and so his rise to the highest seat was crowned with glory and shadowed with grief in the very same hour, as the desert wind is both warm and cold within one breath. Up next in Chapter 14, Alia and the Years of Regency, we'll drift softly forward into the strange childhood of Paul's sister, born already awake and knowing, and we'll settle gently into the long, quiet years when the young Alia watched over the empire and the desert kept its ancient secrets beneath the moons. Chapter 14. Alia and the Years of Regency, when the great emperor Paul Muad'Dib at last walked out into the deep desert, blinded and quiet, choosing the old Fremen way of a man who gives himself back to the sand. The empire he had built did not fall silent all at once. It held its breath. Across 1,000 worlds the news travelled slowly, gently, like the shadow of a cloud passing over dunes, and everywhere people looked toward the world of Arrakis, toward the great city of Arrakeen, wondering who now would hold the reins of so vast and so strange a dominion. The answer, softly spoken and long expected, was the name of his sister, Alia Atreides, whom the Fremen called Saint Alia of the Knife, would rule as regent for the two small children of Paul and his beloved Chani, the infant twins whose lives had only just begun. To understand Alia in these long years, one must first remember the great and secret thing that had shaped her from before her birth. She was one of the pre-born, one who had awakened in the womb. For her mother, the Lady Jessica, had drunk the sacred water of life while Alia was still forming within her, and in that single luminous moment, the poison that transforms had passed into the unborn child as well. And so Alia came into the world already knowing. She was a baby who spoke as a grown woman, a small girl who carried within her the memories and the wisdom of countless ancestors, all of them living quietly inside her mind, generation upon generation, mothers and grandmothers of grandmothers reaching back into the dim beginnings of the human story. The Bene Gesserit sisterhood, who had watched over such matters for 90 generations, spoke of this condition in low and fearful voices, and they had a single hard word for what such a child might one day become. They called it abomination. Yet for many years the fear seemed unfounded, for Alia was gifted beyond measure. She could see, with the ancestral wisdom folded within her, things that others could not. She had a sureness of judgment and a swiftness of understanding that made her seem, to the awed Fremen, less a woman than a small living goddess who had stepped down out of legend to walk among them. During the years of her brother's reign, she had served the regency of the faith, tending the great religious order that had grown up around the name of Muad'Dib, and the pilgrims who came from 1,000 worlds bowed before her as they bowed before her brother. Now, with Paul gone into the sand, the whole weight of the empire settled softly and heavily upon her narrow shoulders, and she took it up in the name of the twins, Leto, the second of that name, and his sister Ghanima, who slept in their cradles while she governed in their stead. At first the regency held. Alia ruled from the Great Keep, the vast citadel that Paul had raised at the edge of Arrakeen, a fortress so enormous that whole cities of the old days might have hidden within its walls. She kept the machinery of empire turning. She received ambassadors and priests. She managed the flow of the precious spice, the melange that gave the empire its long life and its strange sight. And she kept watch over the many powers that circled the throne like patient birds. The Bene Gesserit and the Spacing Guild, and the ancient great houses, each of them waiting to see whether a child empire could survive the loss of its prophet. And for a while it did survive, and the sisters of her order tended the twins, and the great desert of Arrakis rolled on beneath the moons, calm and enormous and old. But within Aliyah, in the deep and secret country of her many lives, a slow and terrible change had begun. For the preborn carry a heavy burden that no ordinary soul must bear. The countless ancestral memories within them are not silent and obedient. They live. In their fashion, they press, and they murmur, and they long once more to look out through living eyes, to taste, and to move, and to rule. A grown person who takes the water of life, as the Reverend Mothers do, comes to that inner multitude already formed, already strong, an anchor around which the ancestors must arrange themselves. But Aliyah had met them in the womb, before ever she had a self of her own to stand against them, and so all her life she had walked a narrow ledge above a great inner sea, holding the crowd of the dead at bay by will alone, and among that crowd there was one who was neither patient nor kind. Deep in the ancestral memory of Aliyah there lived the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, her own grandfather on her mother's side, the vast and cunning enemy of House Atreides, the man whose schemes had brought down her grandfather Duke Leto and drowned the family in blood. He was dead, long dead, fallen on the floor of a great hall in the days of the old rebellion. Yet a fragment of him, the shape and the appetite and the sly persuasion of him, lived on within his granddaughter, as all ancestors lived on within her, and this one did not sleep. In the long quiet nights of the Regency he began to speak to her from within, gentle at first, offering counsel, offering comfort, offering the small pleasures that ease a lonely and overburdened heart, and Aliyah, weary with rule and hollow with grief, began, only a little at a time, to listen. This was the fate the sisterhood had feared and named, the slow inward conquest of the living by the dead, the abomination coming true at last. It did not arrive as a storm. It came as a softening, a giving way, a quiet turning of one thing into another over many years, the way the desert wind reshapes a dune so gradually that no single grain seems to move. Aliyah governed still, but a strangeness entered her governing. She grew suspicious where once she had been sure, cruel where once she had been just, secretive in ways she could not have explained even to herself. The order of priests around her hardened into something colder, and the great religion of Muad'Dib, which had begun in wonder, began to weigh upon the worlds like a hand closing slowly into a fist. And the more the Baron's whisper guided her, the more alone she became, ashamed and afraid, and unable to speak of the thing that was eating her from within. So the years of the Regency passed under a lengthening shadow. To the pilgrims and the ordinary people, Aliyah was still the holy sister on the throne, radiant and untouchable, keeper of her brother's flame. But those closest to her, and above all the Lady Jessica, when at last she returned, would come to sense the change, the presence of another will moving behind the beloved and familiar face, and would grieve for the bright preborn child who had been lost by inches to the crowd inside her. It is a sorrowful story and a mysterious one of great gifts turned slowly into a great affliction, of a mind too crowded with the past to keep hold of its own quiet present, and of an empire drifting on beneath the enormous desert stars while its guardians struggled, in silence, against enemies no army could reach. Up next in Chapter 15, the twins Leto II and Ghanima will settle softly beside the two small children of Muad'Dib as they grow within the citadel and begin, in their own gentle and uncanny way, to sense the shadow gathering around their aunt and to carry between them the strange inheritance of their father's sight. Chapter 15. The twins, Leto II and Ghanima, in the long quiet years that followed the passing of Paul Muad'Dib into the desert, when the sand had closed over his footsteps and the wind had smoothed away every trace of the man who had once been the emperor of 1,000 worlds, two small children grew up within the great stronghold of Arrakis, and they were the twin son and daughter of Paul and of his beloved Chani, and their names were Leto II and Ghanima. They had come into the world in the same hour, or very nearly so, and Chani had given her last strength to bring them safely from the darkness of the womb into the pale morning light, and then she had slipped away from life as gently as water sinking into thirsty ground. And so the twins had never truly known their mother, though they carried her within them in ways that no ordinary child could ever carry a memory. For these two children, like their Aunt Aliyah before them, had been born already awake. While they slept in their cradles, and while the nursemaids sang the soft songs of the desert over them, they were not the blank and dreaming infants that other babies are, for their small minds were filled with the voices and the recollections of countless ancestors reaching back through the generations, mothers and grandmothers and fathers of fathers, warriors and healers and rulers and simple folk, all of them living on within the twins as a great inner chorus that never entirely fell silent. They knew things that no small child ought to know, and they spoke, when they chose to speak, with a calm and ancient wisdom that made the older members of the court grow uneasy and lower their eyes. For it is a strange and solemn thing to look into the face of a little one, and to feel that something very old and very patient is looking back. And so the two of them, Leto and Ghanima, moved through the vast and echoing halls of their father's citadel like two small candles carrying flames far larger than themselves, and they held each other close, for each was the only true companion of the other, and between them there passed an understanding so deep and so wordless that they hardly needed to speak at all to know the thoughts and the feelings that stirred within one another. Ghanima, whose name in the old tongue meant something taken as spoils in battle, was quick and bright and fierce beneath her gentleness, and Leto, who bore the name of his noble grandfather the old Duke, was quieter and more inward, and his gaze often drifted toward horizons that no one else could see. The court in which they grew was no longer the court of hope and glory that had once gathered around their father. The power of the empire now rested in the hands of their aunt, the Lady Aliyah, who ruled as regent in the name of the twins until they should come of age, and Aliyah's rule had begun to darken and to fray at its edges. The multitude of ancestral voices that dwelt within her had grown wild and quarrelsome over the long years, and one voice among them, cruel and cunning and hungry for the pleasures of the living world, had slowly gained a terrible mastery over her. And so the aunt who should have been the shield and the guardian of the children became instead a place of shadow and of danger, and the twins, young as they were, understood this with a clear and sorrowful knowing, and they watched her with love and with wariness both, grieving for the person she had been and fearing the thing that she was becoming. Around the two children there gathered many plots, as bees will gather where there is something sweet and precious to be taken. For whoever might control the heirs of Muad'Dib would hold in their hands the future of the whole of the Imperium. In the far reaches of exile there lived the remnants of the old House Corrino, the family that had ruled before Paul had cast them down, and they had never ceased to dream of returning to the throne that had once been theirs. And they wove their patient schemes across the great gulf of space, sending gifts and gentle-seeming creatures that hid within them the sharp edge of murder. Even from within the family itself there came uncertainty and division, for the Lady Jessica, grandmother of the twins and mother of Paul and of Aaliyah, had at last returned from her long absence upon the green world of Caladan, and she came back changed and troubled, sent by her old sisterhood to look upon the children and to judge whether they were a blessing to be nurtured or a peril to be quietly put away. And though her heart was torn with love for her grandchildren, she moved among them as one who carried secret duties. And the twins, seeing all things with their ancient inner eyes, understood that even their grandmother's embrace held a question that had not yet been answered. Yet of all the perils that pressed upon them from without, it was the peril within Leto's own visions that weighed upon him most heavily in the long nights. For the boy had inherited, along with all the memories of his line, a portion of his father's terrible gift, the power to gaze forward along the branching pathways of time and to see the many futures that lay coiled within the present moment like the folds of a great sleeping serpent. And when Leto let his mind drift out along those pathways, he saw again and again the same dark ending toward which all the gentle currents of history seemed to be flowing, a slow fading of the human spirit, a withering of the wild will to grow and to wander and to survive, until at last the whole of humankind might dwindle and be extinguished as a lamp is extinguished when the last of its oil is spent. But threaded through that great darkness, Leto also glimpsed a single narrow path, a golden thread winding through the ruin, and this he came in time to call the Golden Path, and it was the one way he could find by which the human race might be led through its long peril and out again into safety on the far side of the ages. Yet the price of that path was so vast and so strange and so lonely that even Leto, wise beyond all his years, trembled in the quiet of his heart to contemplate it, for it would ask of the one who walked it a sacrifice greater than any king or prophet had ever been asked to make, the surrender of his very humanity for the sake of all the generations that were yet unborn. And so the twins, these two small and gentle children who loved each other more than they loved their own lives, came slowly to understand that they stood as the last true hope of the ancient House of Atreides, and that upon their choices, made in the tender years of childhood, when other children think only of games and of sleep, there hung the fate of worlds beyond counting. They spoke of these things together in the soft darkness, calmly and without fear, weighing the long roads before them, and each drew from the other the courage that neither could have found alone, and above them the desert stars wheeled slowly through the black and patient sky, indifferent and eternal, as though waiting to see which of the many futures the children would at last decide to make real. For now let us leave the two of them there, safe within one another's keeping, watched over by the ghosts of all their ancestors and by the great silence of Arrakis, and let us carry with us into sleep the tender image of that brother and that sister, holding hands against the dark. Up next, in Chapter 16, Leto II, the God Emperor, will follow the boy who saw the Golden Path as he gives himself over to a change so profound and so lasting that the very meaning of what it is to be human will be reshaped, and will drift together through the long, strange dream of an emperor who chose to become something more than a man for the sake of us all. Chapter 16. Leto II, the god emperor in the long and quiet years that followed the coming of the twins. It was the boy Leto, the second of his name, who carried within him the deepest listening. He and his sister Ghanima had shared the same womb and the same terrible gift, the awakened memory of all their ancestors, and they had grown together on the desert world of Arrakis with the patience of children who were also, in some hidden way, older than the mountains. Yet where his sister chose the ordinary path of humanity, marrying and living and passing her days as women and men had always done, the boy Leto turned his gaze toward a horizon that no other living soul could bear to look upon, and in the stillness of the deep desert, he began to walk a road that would take him far beyond the shape of a man. There is a small creature in the sands of Arrakis called the sand trout, and it is the young form of the great sandworm, the Maker, the vast beast that swims beneath the dunes and gives to the universe its most precious substance. The sand trout are soft and leathery, and they move like living gloves across the skin of the world, gathering water, sealing it away deep beneath the ground so that the desert may remain dry and the worms may live. For untold ages, these small creatures had been only a curiosity, a thing that children caught and that the desert folk knew by name. But Leto II, guided by the memories of 1,000 ancestors and by a vision of the far future, understood that within these gentle little beings there lay the key to a transformation that no human had ever dared. Slowly, and with a calm that seems almost beyond understanding, the boy allowed the sand trout to come to him. He let them creep across his hands and along his arms, and he did not draw back when they began to join together over his skin, forming a living membrane that clung to him like a second flesh. It was a union of two natures, a symbiosis, a joining in which the creature and the boy became partners in one body. The living skin covered him, and it made him stronger than any man had ever been, swifter, harder to wound, able to run across the burning sand without tiring, and to strike with a force that no ordinary body could match. And in exchange, the sand trout's skin began, over the long, slow turning of the years, to change him, to carry him gently and without pain toward a shape that was neither wholly human nor wholly worm, but something new beneath the two moons. This was the price he chose, and it was a heavy one, for it meant the quiet setting aside of an ordinary human life. He would never grow old and die in the manner of his forefathers. He would never sit at an evening table as a simple man among his family, nor feel the plain and gentle passing of a single mortal span. The living skin would lengthen his years far beyond counting, and as the centuries flowed over him, it would remake his body little by little, until his limbs softened into the long ribbed length of the great desert worm, and only his face, the calm and thoughtful face of the boy he had been, remained as a memory of the human child who had made this choice. He accepted this burden because he had seen, in his prophetic dreaming, that someone must carry it, and that no other soul in all the worlds was willing. And so there rose upon Arrakis, and upon the whole of the known universe, the strange and solemn majesty of the god Emperor of Dune. Leto II, part man and part maker, took the throne that his father Paul had once refused to hold forever, and he gathered into his patient hands the reins of every planet and every people. For thousands upon thousands of years he ruled, longer than any emperor before him, longer than dynasties and languages and the memory of nations. Generations were born and lived and died and were forgotten while he endured. The same vast and gentle presence upon the sand, watching the turning of the stars with eyes that had seen the beginning of his line and that gazed steadily toward its distant end. He was immensely strong, this ruler who was more than a man, and immensely lonely. No other being in all creation shared his nature or could truly stand beside him. He could not love in the ordinary way, nor be held, nor walk unremarked among crowds, for his body had become a wonder and a marvel, long and powerful and terrible to behold, resting upon a royal cart that bore his great weight across the halls of his citadel. Yet within that changed and mighty form there remained the mind of a thoughtful boy and the memory of a mother and a father and a sister he had loved, and the tenderness of a human heart beat on beneath the armor of the Maker's skin, hidden but never lost. The people of the many worlds came to look upon him as a god, and in truth he held in his single body more power than any god of old story had ever claimed. He controlled the spice, the substance of the worms, and through the spice he held the whole of the empire in a quiet and unbreakable grip. Rebellions rose and fell like small waves against a cliff. Great houses schemed and were gently thwarted. The sisterhoods and the guilds and the ancient orders bent themselves, one after another, to the slow will of the one who could not be outweighted. For how could any plotter hope to outlast a ruler who counted his reign, not in years, but in ages? And behind all of this vast and patient rule there lay a single hidden purpose, a secret that Leto II carried in silence through all the long millennia of his reign. He did not seek power for its own sake, nor did he cherish the loneliness of his throne. He had looked far down the corridors of time, further than any prescient soul before him, and he had seen a shadow gathering at the end of humanity, a moment in which the whole of the species might wither and vanish and be lost forever among the cold and silent stars. To turn his people away from that ending, to teach them across countless generations a lesson so deep that it would settle into their very bones and never be forgotten. He took upon himself the shape of a tyrant and the burden of an endless life. Every law he made, every peace he imposed, every long, slow century of stillness was a single careful step upon a road he alone could see. A road stretched across the ages toward the survival of humankind. He kept this purpose close and told it to almost no one, for it could only be accomplished through patience beyond the measure of mortal minds. Where a man might plan for a season or a lifetime, Leto II planned for tens of thousands of years, moving the great tides of history as gently and as surely as the desert wind moves the dunes, grain by grain, until whole mountains of sand are lifted and set down again in a new place. He was the loneliest being who had ever lived, and the most powerful, and the most patient, a boy who had become a god and a worm and a shepherd of the far future, keeping watch over his sleeping children across the deep and quiet night of the centuries. Up next, in Chapter 17, The Golden Path Across the Millennia, we'll walk softly beside the God Emperor along the hidden road he laid down through time, and see how his long and gentle patience wove a single quiet thread meant to carry all of humankind safely toward the distant morning of its survival. Chapter 17. The Golden Path Across the Millennia. In the long hush that settled over the empire after Leto II had wrapped his growing body in the flesh of the sand trout, there lived a purpose so vast and so patient that no single human mind, save his own, could hold the whole of it at once, and it is to that purpose we turn now, softly. As one turns toward a distant light seen across a darkened plain. The purpose had a name, and the name was the Golden Path, And it was the reason for everything the God Emperor did across 3,500 years. Every cruelty and every kindness, every silence and every slow decree. To understand it, it is to understand why a being who might have simply enjoyed his power chose instead to carry the heaviest burden any living thing has ever carried, and to carry it alone, and to carry it to the very end. Leto had inherited from his father, Paul Muad'Dib, the terrible gift of prescience, the ability to see the branching roads of time laid out like rivers running toward the sea. And where Paul had turned away from the darkest of those visions, unable to bear what they asked of him, Leto looked upon them fully and did not turn away. In the deep well of his foresight, he saw a thing that frightened him more than any war or any famine, and it was this, that humankind, left to drift as it had always drifted, comfortable and clever and forgetful, would in time reach a moment of stillness so complete that it would become fragile, and that from that fragility would come a single catastrophe, one blow from an unseen direction that would end the human story forever and scatter its ashes into a universe that would not remember it had ever been. He saw, in other words, extinction, not as a distant possibility, but as the almost certain destination of every ordinary road, and he understood that the very thing that made his ancestors safe, their tendency to gather under one strong ruler and one strong faith and one comfortable peace, was the very thing that made them easy to destroy all at once. A people who could be governed entirely could be seen entirely, and a people who could be seen entirely could be caught, all of them together, in a single net, and drawn out of existence in a single sorrowful season. Against this Leto set his whole immortal will, and the shape of that resistance was the golden path, a road that wound not toward comfort, but toward survival, a road that would cost more than any other, and yet would leave, at its far end, a humankind that could never again be gathered up and destroyed. To walk that road he chose the strangest of tools, and the tool was himself, and the method was tyranny. He imposed upon the countless worlds a peace so absolute that historians would come to call it, in later ages, a great and heavy stillness, a peace held not by love, but by the certainty of his power, and by the slow, patient pressure of his rule. He allowed little freedom, and he moved his subjects like grain across a threshing floor, and he made himself the single unmoving center of all things, so that every world learned to look to him, and to him alone. It seems, at first, a cruelty without reason, and yet within it lay a lesson he intended humankind to learn so deeply that it would never be forgotten. And the lesson was this, that no people should ever again surrender itself so wholly into the hands of one ruler, for a peace bought at the price of freedom is a peace that teaches its own undoing. He became, quite deliberately, the worst of all possible masters, not out of appetite, but out of design, so that when at last his long reign ended, the memory of it would burn in the marrow of every generation that followed, a lesson written in the flesh of history, warning them away forever from the comfortable chains they had once loved. He gave them a tyranny so long and so total that they would spend the rest of their existence fleeing from anything that resembled it, and in that flight lay their freedom, and in that freedom lay their safety, and in that safety lay the survival of the whole humankind. He wounded them, gently and for a very long time, so that the wound would keep them alive. Yet the enforced peace was only one half of his great and lonely work, for alongside it he tended, across the slow turning of the centuries, a breeding program of exquisite care, guiding the marriages and the bloodlines of chosen families toward a single quiet miracle, He sought to bring into being men and women who could not be seen by prescience, human beings whose paths were invisible to any inner eye, who would move through the fabric of time as shadows move across water, leaving no ripple that a seer might follow. In this, he planted the true seed of the golden path, for if there could exist people whom no oracle could track, then never again could any tyrant, not even one as powerful as himself, spread a net across the whole of the future and hold the entire species helpless within it. Consider the strange mercy folded inside that intention. Leto, who saw all roads, labored for thousands of years to create the very beings who would blind him, who would close the door of foresight against him and against all who might come after. And he did this gladly, for he understood that a humankind partly hidden from its own future was a humankind that could never be wholly caught. The invisibility he wove into their blood was a gift of unpredictability, a scattering of the paths of time into so many uncounted directions that no single disaster and no single ruler could ever gather them all. He gave away, deliberately, the certainty that had made him a god, so that his children's children might live in a universe too wide and too wild to be destroyed in one stroke. The cost of all this was measured in freedom, and it was a heavy cost, freely acknowledged and never hidden. Whole generations lived and died beneath his stillness, knowing little of the wider dance of choice, tending their small lives under the shadow of a ruler who would not pass away. They paid, without ever fully knowing it, for a future they would never see, and Leto carried the weight of that debt within himself, feeling each life he constrained as a small closing of a door that he alone had the vision to justify. He asked of humankind a long and patient endurance, and he asked it because the alternative, glimpsed clearly in his prescient sight, was an emptiness in which there would be no humankind left at all to be free. And through every year of it he was alone, more alone than any creature has ever been, for he had traded away his own humanity piece by piece to become the thing the golden path required. His body had become monstrous and strange, half of the desert and half of the man he had once been, and his heart remembered tenderness the way one remembers a country left long ago, with a love grown quiet and far. He would never walk the road to its end, never stand in the freed and scattered future he was building, never know the faces of the invisible ones for whose sake he had given up his youth and his shape and his rest. He was a god who sowed a garden he would not live to see bloom, and he tended it anyway, gravely and gently, through the whole long night of the millennia, holding the future safe with his own vanished life. Up next in Chapter 18, The Scattering and the Return, we'll drift softly forward to the moment when the long stillness at last gives way, and follow the freed and hidden children of humankind as they pour outward into the wide dark, scattering like seeds upon a patient wind, carrying with them the quiet gift that Leto gave and never lived to witness. Chapter 18. The Scattering and the Return. When the great worm that had once been Leto II finally came apart upon the wooden bridge above the river of Idaho, and when the water rose to meet the ruined length of his body, something older than empire and older than sorrow began quietly to happen, and it happened so gently that the world hardly noticed at first. From every part of that vast dying form, small pearls of life let themselves loose, and each of these small living things was a sand trout, patient and blind and endlessly hungry. A creature that had slept within the god emperor for more than 3,500 years, folded into his flesh as a promise, waiting to be kept. He had carried them all that long while, these countless little makers, and he had told those who would listen that his death was not an ending, but a scattering of his own substance across the sand. And now, as the river took him, the promise began to unfold in the slow and certain manner of all deep natural things. The sand trout spread outward into the soil of Arrakis, and they did what their ancient nature commanded, which was to find water and to wall it away, to seal the moisture of the planet into deep and hidden cisterns far beneath the surface, so that the land above might grow dry once more. For long ages, the human hands of the Empire had labored to make that desert world green, planting the northern slopes with grasses and orchards and gentle standing pools, coaxing rivers where once there had been only dunes. And the God Emperor had permitted this greening because it served his hidden purpose, driving the old worms toward extinction so that he alone might hold the last of the spice. Now, with his passing, the balance he had guarded turned slowly the other way, and the little makers began the long undoing of all that green softness, drinking the world dry acre by patient acre, returning Arrakis by slow and tender degrees to the desert it had always longed to be. And in that returning desert, out of the union of the sand trout as they grew and joined and changed, the sandworms came again into the land. Each of the small blind makers was a fragment of the God Emperor himself, and within each one there lingered a dreaming remnant of his awareness, a pearl of memory that would ride inside the new worms for as long as the worms endured, so that some faint and scattered echo of Leto would wander the dunes forever, dispersed across 10,000 separate lives, awake and yet not awake, present and yet at peace. In this way he was neither wholly gone nor ever again gathered into one, and the desert that swallowed him became the truest and gentlest of all his tombs, breathing him out with every dry wind that crossed the open sand. Yet the turning of a world does not come without its long season of hardship, and the years that followed the death of the God Emperor came to be remembered as the famine times. For all the centuries of his reign he had held humankind still, gathering the threads of travel and trade and grain into his own hand, doling out spice and safety in careful measure, teaching the species through the very tightness of his grip what it felt like to be caged. He had done this on purpose, with a patience that no ordinary mind could hold, because he wished the memory of that captivity to be burned so deeply into the blood of humankind that they would never again allow themselves to be gathered by any single power. And when his hand at last released them, the sudden loss of his order sent tremors of hunger and confusion across the settled worlds, the old certainties failing, the granaries emptying, the great web of guided starflight fraying at its edges. Out of that hunger and that fear was born the thing he had prepared the whole of his long life to make possible, and it came to be called the scattering. In numbers beyond any counting, the people of the old empire rose up and went outward, away from the worn and familiar center of things, away from Arrakis and the 1,000 known worlds, pressing into the dark and unmapped reaches of the galaxy where no charted road had ever run. Some fled famine, and some fled the memory of the tyrant, and some simply felt within their hearts a restlessness that had no name, an urge planted in them across all those bound generations. And they carried it outward, like seed carried on a great and gentle wind. They went so far and in so many directions that no map could hold them, and no memory could follow them. And they founded lives and worlds in places that the old center would never learn the names of. This was the true shape of the Golden Path, the vision the God Emperor had walked in his mind across 3,500 years. And now it lay fulfilled in the quiet fact of the scattering. For humankind had been spread so wide and grown so various and so far beyond the reach of any counting that never again could the whole of the species be gathered into one place, and so never again could the whole of it be threatened, or ruled, or ended by any single hand, whether that hand belonged to a tyrant, or to a machine, or to some blind turning of fortune. The lesson of the cage and the freedom of the open dark had been woven together into a single safeguard, and that safeguard was survival itself, endless and dispersed and impossible to undo. This was the gift he had bought with his loneliness, and it was given so softly that most who received it never knew a gift had passed to them at all. The ages that came after the scattering unrolled with the slow grandeur of tides. The old world settled into new patterns, and the ancient orders learned to live in a galaxy grown quiet at its heart and unknowable at its edges. The keepers of the old ways, the sisterhood who counted their memories back across the centuries, and the men who steered ships without the machines of the forbidden past, and the guardians of the desert planet, all of these carried their traditions forward through the long generations, tending the small flame of the known against the vast dark of the unknown. Arrakis turned fully back to sand, and the worms grew great again upon it, and the spice flowed once more from the deep places, and for a long and gentle, while the center of the human story dreamed on in something like peace. But the dark, into which the scattered had gone, was not empty, and it did not leave them unchanged. Across the uncounted years, far beyond the sight of the old worlds, the wanderers had grown into new peoples with new strengths and new hungers, shaped by trials no one at the center could imagine, and some among them had learned powers and appetites that the old traditions had never dreamed of. And so, in the later ages of the long story, some of the scattered came home again, drawn back across the immense dark toward the worlds their distant ancestors had fled, returning not as lost children, but as strangers grown strange and powerful, and, in certain cases, dangerous beyond easy understanding. Their coming would stir the quiet center once more, and set the ancient orders to reckoning with forces born in places no map had ever held, so that the very dispersal which had saved the species became also the source of its next great turning. Yet all of that lay softly ahead, gathering like weather far out beyond the edge of sleep, and for now the desert breathed, and the worms dreamed their scattered dreams, and the long night held its calm. Up next, in Chapter 19, the Atreides blood in the later ages will follow the quiet thread of that ancient family down through the long generations after the God Emperor, and rest our thoughts gently upon how the old and gifted bloodline endured, hidden and changed, into the far reaches of the story yet to come. Chapter 19. The Atreides blood in the later ages. Long after the scattering had carried the children of humankind out into the dark between the stars, and long after those who fled and those who returned had woven their countless quiet threads back through the settled worlds, there remained one gentle constant running underneath all of the ages, softer than a heartbeat, and yet more enduring than any throne. That constant was the blood of the Atreides, the blood of the Red Hawk, which had passed out of the old empire of Paul and out of the vast still reign of Leto II, and had gone on flowing, generation after patient generation, through the long calm river of time. It did not shine the way it had shone in the days of the desert prophet. It did not command legions or bend the futures of whole planets to its will. Yet it endured, and in its enduring it kept a promise that had been made in the deepest silence of the God Emperor's heart, a promise meant to be kept across thousands upon thousands of gentle years. In the far ages that came after the great worm had at last let his long body fall and had scattered himself into the sands he loved, there lived a woman named Siona, a daughter of the House of Atreides in a diminished and softened world. She was descended, across an unimaginable stretch of quiet centuries, from the very line that Leto II had tended with such careful and lonely devotion, and she carried within her cells a small miracle that her distant ancestor had labored across 3,500 years to bring into being. Siona could not be seen, not by the eyes, for she walked and breathed as any other person walked and breathed, but by the inner sight, by the reaching, prescient gaze that had once let Paul and Leto look down the branching corridors of what might come. To that gaze she was simply absent, a soft blank place in the weave of the future, a shadow that no oracle could follow. She was the living fruit of the golden path, the thing the God Emperor had suffered so long and so patiently to create, a human being whom no tyrant of foresight could ever again trap or predict or own. It is a gentle thing to consider, in the hush of a quiet night, that all of Leto's endless sacrifice, all his centuries of stillness upon the throne, had aimed at this one soft mercy. He had made himself into a terrible and lonely thing so that humankind might one day slip free of the very gift that had first raised his family to power. The prescience that had once been the Atreides' glory became, in the fullness of the long ages, the thing they quietly set their people free from, and Siona, walking unseen through the future, was the proof that the long lesson had been learned. The seed that would spread her hidden nature outward through the whole scattered species until no single vision could ever again gather all of humankind into one hand. The blood of the Red Hawk had become, in the end, the blood of freedom. Alongside that hidden line there ran another thread, stranger still, and yet no less faithful, and it was the thread of Duncan Idaho. He had been the swordmaster of the old Duke Leto upon Caladan in the days before the fall of the house upon Arrakis, and he had given his life so that a boy and his mother might live. Yet death, in the deep machinery of the later ages, did not keep him. Again and again, across the vast slow turning of the millennia, the Tleilaxu grew his body anew from the smallest remembered cell, and again, a Duncan Idaho opened his eyes upon a world that had aged 10,000 years while he slept in nothingness. He was the Gola, the one who returned, revived past all counting, a single loyal spirit carried like a candle from one distant century to the next. Through all his many lives he remained bound to the Atreides, drawn to them across the gulf of time, a servant and a friend, and a keeper of an old faithfulness that neither he nor anyone else could quite explain. There is something wonderfully soothing in the picture of that one man walking through age after age, always the same in his loyal heart, and yet always waking into a stranger and stranger world. He became a kind of living memory for the whole span of Dune's history, a thread of continuity that the God Emperor himself had cherished and needed, keeping a Duncan near him through all the long, lonely centuries of his reign. And when at last the empire of the worm gave way to the softer and more scattered ages that followed, still the Duncan Golas came, still they were grown and wakened and welcomed, carrying the old Atreides loyalty forward like a lamp handed gently from one dark room into the next. In the later ages that the chronicles call the time of the heretics and of Chapter House, when the sisterhood of the Bene Gesserit had become one of the great quiet powers holding the scattered worlds together, the blood of the Atreides remained a treasure beyond price in their long and patient designs. For thousands of years those careful women had bred and guided the human lines, seeking always to strengthen and to widen the species, and in the Atreides genes they saw both the hidden gift of Siona and the deep faithfulness carried in the flesh of the endless Duncans. The sisters gathered those precious strands into their own vast, slow weaving, hoping to bind the wild new peoples of the far scattering back into the gentle family of humankind, and hoping, too, to keep alive the freedom from prescience that Leto had bought at so great a cost. Even in that distant age, when the name of Paul had faded almost wholly into legend, and the desert of Arrakis was but a memory of a memory, the Red Hawk still cast its soft shadow across the counsels of the powerful and the dreaming of the wise. And so the blood of the Atreides went on shaping the destiny of humankind long after the empire that bore their name had crumbled into story. It shaped that destiny not through conquest, for the age of conquest had passed, and not through prophecy, for prophecy itself had been the very thing they taught their children to escape. It shaped that destiny instead through endurance and through faithfulness, through a hidden gift passed quietly from mother to daughter, and through a loyal heart returned again and again from the far side of death. The house that had begun upon the green and rain-soft world of Caladan, that had risen and fallen upon the burning sands of Dune, that had climbed to the terrible throne of a living God, and had chosen at last to give its people the gift of freedom, went on living in the deep current of time, gentle and quiet and unbroken. If you listen closely in the stillness, you can almost feel that current moving beneath all the noise of the great deeds of history, a slow, warm river of belonging that never quite ran dry. The prophets faded, the emperors slept, the desert changed and changed again, and yet the blood of the Red Hawk went on, carrying its two soft promises through the ages, the promise of a people no vision could ever cage, and the promise of a loyalty that no death could ever end. And in that long, unhurried endurance there is a kind of peace, the peace of knowing that some gentle things, once truly made, are made to last far beyond the lives that make them. Up next in Chapter 20, 10,000 Years of the Red Hawk, we will drift back gently over the whole long span of the Atreides, from the shores of Caladan to the farthest quiet reaches of the scattering, and let the full sweep of their story settle softly around us like a warm blanket at the close of a very long and peaceful night. Chapter 20, 10,000 Years of the Red Hawk. And so, at the far end of all the long roads that had carried the blood of the Atreides across the ages, there comes a quiet hour when the whole of their story may be gathered up and held gently in the mind, the way a traveler at the close of a long day gathers the small stones he has carried in his pocket and lays them softly upon the sill to rest. For the tale of House Atreides is not the tale of a single life, nor of a single world, but of 10,000 years, and of a green banner and a red hawk carried faithfully from the ocean cliffs of Caladan out into the dry immensity of the desert, and then further still, out among the scattered and countless stars. In the beginning of that long remembrance there was water, and the sound of water, for the ancestral home of the Atreides, was the world of Caladan, a place of gray seas and gentle rains, of fishing boats returning at dusk, and of orchards heavy with fruit above the rocky shore. There the family had ruled for 26 generations, and there the green and black banner had flown above the old castle while the tides moved patiently below. It was a place of dampness and of growing things, and the people who dwelt there loved their duke, and their duke loved them, and something in that mutual and unhurried loyalty would follow the family forever after, like a scent carried in cloth long after the flowers have faded. Upon that banner, and upon the ring worn by the head of the house, there was the sign of the red hawk, wings spread, keen and proud and watchful. The hawk was an emblem of vigilance and of a certain fierce tenderness, and it seemed to gather into a single shape the things the Atreides most prized, which were honor before advantage, loyalty before safety, and love before power. These were the qualities by which they had chosen to be known, and by which, across the long centuries, they would again and again be measured. The story turns, as all who remember it know, upon a single duke and a single desert. For the family was drawn away from the soft rains of Caladan to the burning world of Arrakis, which men called Dune. A planet of endless sand, and of the precious spice that was the treasure of the whole empire. And there, through betrayal and through the working of old and patient enemies, the good duke fell, and the great house was very nearly extinguished in a single terrible night. Yet even in that fall the ideals of the hawk did not perish, for the duke had loved his son and his lady with a whole heart, and that love passed onward into the sand like water sinking to a hidden spring. Out of that spring rose the sun, who fled into the deep desert and was taken in among the fierce free people who dwelt there. Among them, the boy became a man, and the man became more than a man, a figure of prophecy and of terrible destiny, a Messiah upon whom the hopes and the fears of an entire empire came at last to rest. He mounted the great worms of the desert, he mastered the visions of the spice, and he rose to a throne that no single planet could contain, so that the green banner of a fallen duke came in time to fly above the whole of the known universe. And yet the sun carried within him always the memory of the ocean world and the weight of the crown he had gained through sorrow. For the rise of the Messiah was purchased with a grief that no victory could wholly repay. The tale does not rest there, for the blood of the hawk ran onward into stranger and lonelier heights. There came at last one of that line who chose to bind himself to the sand trout and the desert, and who took upon his own body the slow transformation into something no longer merely human, a ruler who lived for thousands upon thousands of years and who set his whole vast being to a single hidden purpose. He became a kind of god upon his throne, and he laid upon all of humankind a long and narrow discipline, a great and deliberate tightening of the ages, so that the race would grow desperate to scatter and to run. This he did not for glory had long since ceased to touch him, but out of a love so wide and so cold and so far-seeing that it could only be understood as sacrifice. He gave up his own humanity and endured his own long loneliness and accepted at the end his own necessary passing, in order that the people he loved might never again be gathered into one place where a single blow could destroy them all. And when that god-emperor fell and his long reign was broken, the thing he had prepared came to pass, for humanity burst outward like seed flung from an opened hand, out past the edges of every map, into the far and unknown dark, into so many hidden places, and along so many secret roads, that no power, however great, could ever again find them all, or bind them all, or end them all. This was the scattering, and it was the strange and quiet gift of the desert throne, a freedom bought across 10,000 years by a family that had begun upon a rainy world beside a gray and patient sea. So it is that a single noble house, small at its beginning and dwelling upon one green and watery world, came in the end to shape the destiny of all humankind. Through the fall of a duke, through the rise of a Messiah, through the long sacrifice of a god-emperor, through the great scattering of the people into safety, the same few ideals were carried onward unbroken, the honor and the loyalty and the love, and the tragedy that so often walked beside them like a shadow beside a walking figure at evening. The Red Hawk had flown from the cliffs of Caladan to the dunes of Arrakis, and outward at last among the stars, and everywhere it flew it carried the same old and gentle meaning. For that is the deepest truth of the long story, that names endure and ideals endure even when the worlds that bore them have turned to dust and the thrones that held them have crumbled into legend. Somewhere, in the countless scattered places to which humanity had fled, the memory of the Atreides remained, spoken softly in the telling of old tales, honored in the naming of children, kept alive in the quiet resolve of those who chose honor before advantage, and loyalty before safety, and love before power, exactly as a certain family upon a rainy world had chosen to do so very long ago. And now the tale is nearly told, and the great banner may be furled at last, and the long roads may be allowed to grow quiet beneath the stars. 10,000 years have passed before us, like the slow turning of a single night toward morning, and all the sorrows and the triumphs of that vast and noble house have found their place within the calm and completed whole. There is nothing left now to hurry toward, nothing left to fear, only the gentle and abiding sense of a great story gently finished, of a proud name safely carried home, and of a red hawk folding its wings softly at the end of a very long flight. Let the seas of Caladan move quietly in the dark, and let the sands of Arrakis lie cool beneath the risen moons, and let all the scattered worlds turn slowly and safely through the peaceful deep. The story is complete. The house has kept its faith, and here, in this last still hour, everything may be set gently down, and everything may be allowed at last to rest. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed House Atreides from its most ancient origins and the blood of old Earth, through the rise of a great house on the ocean world of Caladan, and the code of loyalty and honor that set them apart. We traced the long feud with House Harkonnen, the justice of Duke Leto, the quiet strength of Lady Jessica, and the loyal men who served them. We stood in the Emperor's trap on Arrakis and watched Duke Leto fall. We followed Paul and Jessica among the Fremen and the rise of the Atreides Empire, the regency of Alia, the twins, and the God Emperor Leto II upon his golden path across the millennia. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each name and each age drift gently away from you, down through still dark water, until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If these long, slow stories help you sleep, a gentle subscribe keeps them coming.